Imagine lying in bed at the threshold between wakefulness and sleep, when suddenly a deafening sound tears through your consciousness like a sonic boom, a crack of thunder, or the violent crash of cymbals colliding in the darkness of your mind. Yet when you jolt awake in terror, your bedroom remains silent and undisturbed, and no one else has heard anything at all. This is exploding head syndrome, a sleep disorder that affects millions of people worldwide, particularly during periods of stress, fatigue, or significant life changes. And while the name itself sounds catastrophic and dangerous, the phenomenon is entirely harmless, though profoundly unsettling to those who experience it. The sensation typically involves a sudden, loud auditory hallucination that occurs as the brain transitions between sleep stages, a moment when your consciousness is caught between two different states of neural activity and communication. During this liminal space, the auditory cortex of the brain can fire spontaneously without corresponding external stimuli, creating phantom sounds that feel absolutely real and immediate to the experiencing person. And because this occurs during the hypnagogic state, when your logical reasoning is diminished, you cannot immediately rationalize away the terror. The mechanism appears related to a misfiring in the sleep-wake cycle, where certain neural pathways that normally suppress sensory processing during sleep become momentarily overactive, allowing fragments of dreams or spontaneous neural noise to be interpreted as external reality. What makes this condition particularly fascinating is that despite our advanced understanding of neurology and the widespread documentation of this syndrome in medical literature, people still experience profound fear and confusion when it happens, still question their sanity, and still feel a deep sense of violation even when they understand intellectually that nothing dangerous has occurred. Have you ever stood on a high balcony, looked down at the street far below, and felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to jump, even though you have no desire to harm yourself? Have you found yourself gripping the steering wheel tighter while driving on a highway overpass, seized by a strange impulse to swerve into oncoming traffic, despite being a cautious and responsible driver? These unsettling moments are part of a phenomenon that psychologists call the call of the void, or in French, l'appel du vide, and it affects far more people than most realize. When standing at a height or in a situation where danger is possible, many individuals experience intrusive thoughts that suggest self-harm, even when they possess no genuine suicidal intent or death wish whatsoever. The experience typically involves a brief, unwanted mental image or urge that arrives suddenly and uninvited, creating a jarring disconnect between what we intellectually know we want and what our mind momentarily suggests we might do. Scientists believe this phenomenon emerges from the way our brains process risk and danger, particularly through a mechanism called high place phenomenon. When we encounter a height or precarious situation, our brain's threat detection systems activate automatically, heightening our awareness of what could go wrong. At the same time, the brain's attention systems become intensely focused on the danger itself, essentially ruminating on the very outcome we most want to avoid. This creates a strange paradox where thinking about the danger actually makes the intrusive thought more vivid and more present. The call of the void persists across cultures and throughout human history, despite being entirely irrational and serving no evolutionary purpose, suggesting that it represents a fundamental quirk of how human consciousness operates rather than a sign of psychological disturbance. Imagine waking in the dead of night, your consciousness suddenly snapping into awareness, yet your body remains completely motionless beneath the sheets, as though an invisible force has pinned you to the mattress, and despite your desperate mental commands to move even a single finger, nothing responds to your will. Your limbs feel heavy as lead, and a profound sense of dread begins creeping through your chest as you lie there, fully aware yet utterly trapped in your own flesh. This is sleep paralysis, a temporary inability to move or speak that occurs when your mind awakens while your body remains locked in the grip of the sleep cycle. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in your brain's attempt to protect you during rapid eye movement sleep, the stage where dreams occur most vividly and your eyes move beneath closed lids. During this dream phase, your brain actually paralyzes your voluntary muscles intentionally, a protective measure that prevents you from physically acting out your dreams and potentially harming yourself or others in your bed. This is called muscle atonia, and it is a completely normal part of the sleep architecture that your nervous system has evolved over millions of years. However, when your consciousness emerges from sleep before this paralysis mechanism has time to release, you become aware of the disconnection between your wakeful mind and your immobilized body, leaving you trapped between two states of being, conscious but powerless. The experience is often accompanied by hallucinations, a phenomenon thought to occur because your brain is still partially in dream mode, still generating the vivid imagery and narratives of sleep, even as your higher cognitive functions activate. Many people report seeing shadowy figures, feeling a weight upon their chest, or sensing a malevolent presence in the room during these episodes, and throughout history and across cultures, these experiences have been attributed to demon. Imagine waking up after surgery to discover that your leg has been amputated, and yet you can still feel it there, as though it exists in the space where it once was, complete with sensations of tingling, itching, or even pain so vivid that you instinctively reach down to scratch an itch on a limb that no longer exists in the physical world. This phenomenon, known as phantom limb sensation, affects the vast majority of amputees in the immediate aftermath of their surgery, with some people reporting these sensations for years or even decades after losing a limb. The person lies in bed, their conscious mind fully aware that the limb is gone, having witnessed the amputation or understanding it intellectually, and yet their body continues to send signals to the brain that insist the limb remains, creating a profound disconnect between reality and perception. The brain, it turns out, maintains a detailed map of the entire body in a region called the somatosensory cortex, and this map does not update instantly when a limb is removed. The neural pathways that once carried signals from the missing limb continue to fire spontaneously, and the brain interprets these signals as sensations originating from the absent body part. Additionally, the surrounding areas of the cortex sometimes expand into the space previously occupied by the missing limb's representation, creating a kind of neural confusion where touch on nearby body parts gets misinterpreted as coming from the phantom limb itself. What makes this particularly fascinating is that phantom sensations often persist despite the complete absence of any physical stimulus, demonstrating how thoroughly the brain prioritizes its internal maps and expectations over external reality. We accept this as a natural consequence of how neurology works, a quirk of our evolutionary design, yet it remains one of the most compelling reminders that our experience of the world is not direct perception. You have been driving on a straight interstate highway for the past hour, and suddenly you realize that you cannot remember the last 20 miles of road you have traveled. Though your hands remained on the wheel, your foot maintained steady pressure on the pedal, and you navigated curves and passed other vehicles without incident. This phenomenon, known as highway hypnosis, represents one of the most unsettling yet common experiences modern drivers encounter, a state in which conscious awareness seems to disconnect from physical action while the body continues to operate with practiced efficiency. The experience feels almost like waking from a vivid dream to find yourself in an unfamiliar location. Except in this case, the unfamiliar location is somewhere you have been actively driving through for the better part of an hour without any recollection of the journey itself. What occurs during this state is not actually a loss of consciousness in the clinical sense, but rather a shift in attention and awareness that allows the brain to operate on what scientists call automaticity, a mode of functioning where well-practiced behaviors require minimal conscious oversight. When you have driven the same highway hundreds of times, or even when you are simply driving on a monotonous stretch of road with minimal visual variation, your brain begins to relegate the task of driving to deeper, more automatic neural pathways, the same systems that allow you to walk without thinking about which foot to move first or tie your shoes without conscious deliberation. Meanwhile, your conscious attention drifts away from the road and toward internal thoughts, daydreams, or the radio playing softly in the background, creating a dissociative gap between awareness and action. The repetitive nature of highway driving, the unchanging landscape, the drone of the engine, and the predictable rhythms of acceleration and deceleration all contribute to a sensory monotony that fails. You walk into a coffee shop you have never visited before, and suddenly everything feels hauntingly familiar: the arrangement of the tables, the way the light falls through the windows, the exact moment a stranger brushes past you. And for a few seconds, your mind insists that you have experienced this precise moment in the past, even though you know with absolute certainty that you have not. This sensation, called déjà vu, which translates from French as already seen, is one of the most perplexing and universal experiences of human consciousness, affecting roughly 50 to 70% of people at least once in their lifetime. The experience typically lasts only seconds to minutes, creating a strange cognitive dissonance where your sense of familiarity and your rational knowledge of the situation exist in direct contradiction, leaving you momentarily disoriented and wondering whether your memory is failing you or whether something stranger is happening within your mind. Scientists have proposed several explanations for this peculiar phenomenon, with one leading theory suggesting that déjà vu occurs due to a brief malfunction in how your brain processes memory and perception. According to this explanation, when you encounter a new situation, your brain is supposed to file it as novel information while simultaneously processing its details in real time. However, sometimes a glitch occurs where the new information is mistakenly routed through the memory retrieval system before being properly encoded as a new experience, creating the false sensation that you are remembering something you are actually seeing for the first time. Another theory proposes that déjà vu results from striking similarities between the current situation and a genuine past experience you have genuinely forgotten, where subtle environmental cues, a particular smell, the configuration of objects in space, or a tone of voice, trigger your implicit memory systems without consciously BR. Have you ever arrived at your destination with virtually no memory of the drive itself, unable to recall whether you stopped at traffic lights or how many turns you made, yet somehow navigating the entire route without incident or accident? This peculiar phenomenon, known as autopilot driving, happens to millions of people every single day, and it represents one of the most remarkable yet unsettling examples of how our brains can operate entirely outside conscious awareness while still maintaining safety and precision. You might have been driving for 30 minutes or an hour, your hands gripping the wheel, your eyes scanning the road, your body responding to curves and stops, yet your conscious mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying a conversation from work or planning dinner or simply lost in abstract thought. The experience is so complete that you genuinely cannot remember segments of time that you were actively experiencing, which creates a strange dissociative quality that feels almost impossible to explain to someone who has not experienced it themselves. This occurs because your brain has learned to divide its processing into two distinct systems: conscious attention and procedural memory, which is the automatic knowledge your brain develops through repetition. When you first learned to drive, every action demanded your complete focus because nothing was automatic. But after years of repetitive practice, your brain encoded the fundamental skills into what researchers call implicit memory, which operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. This system allows your brain to handle the basic mechanics of driving, such as steering, acceleration, braking, and lane maintenance, without requiring your conscious attention, freeing up your cognitive resources for other tasks or simply allowing your mind to wander. Imagine waking up to find yourself standing in your kitchen, fully dressed, with no memory of how you got there, or imagine a loved one discovering you wandering through the hallways of your home in the middle of the night, eyes open yet seemingly unseeing, moving with purpose yet completely unaware of your surroundings. Sleepwalking, or somnambulism as it is known in medical terminology, represents one of the most paradoxical states of human consciousness, where the body engages in complex motor activities while the mind remains locked in sleep, creating a strange dissociation between movement and awareness that defies our basic understanding of how consciousness should work. The sleepwalker might prepare food, navigate stairs, unlock doors, even engage in conversations, all while their brain remains predominantly in a sleeping state, responding to some internal logic that is inaccessible to their waking self. Scientists have discovered that sleepwalking typically occurs during the deepest stages of non-REM sleep, particularly during the slow-wave sleep phases when the brain should be most consolidated and inactive. Yet somehow certain motor pathways remain sufficiently activated to produce coordinated movement while the conscious, deliberative parts of the mind remain offline. The exact neurological mechanism involves a partial awakening of the motor cortex and movement-related brain regions, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and self-awareness, remains suppressed, creating a state where automatic behaviors can execute without conscious control or memory formation. This strange dissociation appears to result from incomplete sleep-wake transitions, where the brain fails to fully synchronize its transition between sleep states, leaving some systems partially activated while others remain dormant. Have you ever found yourself on the edge of sleep, your body relaxed, and your mind drifting into that peculiar space between wakefulness and dreams, only to be jolted suddenly by an involuntary muscle spasm that yanks you back to consciousness with a start. This sudden, unpredictable jerk of your limbs, often accompanied by a sensation of falling or a vague sense of alarm, is what scientists call a hypnic jerk or hypnagogic jerk, and it is an experience that affects nearly 70% of all people at some point in their lives. The jerk itself is typically brief but startling, and it often occurs just as you are beginning to enter the deeper stages of sleep, leaving you momentarily confused and forcing you to restart your entire journey towards slumber. What makes this phenomenon particularly interesting is that it seems entirely purposeless and yet remarkably persistent, occurring night after night for some individuals without any apparent benefit or explanation. Researchers have proposed several competing theories to account for these involuntary muscle contractions, with one prominent explanation rooted in our evolutionary past, suggesting that hypnic jerks may be remnants of an ancient survival mechanism that our primate ancestors once relied upon. According to this theory, as our ancestors prepared for sleep in trees or other elevated positions, their nervous systems would trigger sudden muscle contractions to prevent them from accidentally falling from their perches, a reflexive safeguard against the dangers of unconsciousness in an inherently precarious environment. Another explanation points to the complex neurochemical transitions that occur as your brain shifts from wakefulness to sleep, with certain neurotransmitters being suppressed while others are activated, sometimes creating a momentary discord in the signals between your brain and muscles that results in this involuntary spasm. Consider the experience of recalling a childhood birthday party where you remember the exact color of the cake, the specific jokes your father told, and the particular outfit you wore that day, only to discover years later through photographs or family accounts that these details were entirely invented by your mind. False memory formation is a fascinating and deeply unsettling phenomenon where our brains construct entirely fabricated memories complete with sensory details, emotions, and contextual information that never actually occurred. This happens because memory is not a recording device that captures events with perfect fidelity like a video camera, but rather a reconstruction process where our brain pieces together fragments of information, suggestions from others, and our own expectations about how events should have unfolded. When we retrieve a memory, we are essentially rebuilding it from scattered components stored across different neural networks, and during this reconstruction process, our brain fills in gaps with plausible details that feel absolutely real and convincing. The mechanisms that enable false memory formation include source confusion, where we forget where we learned information and attribute it to direct experience; imagination inflation, where repeatedly imagining an event can make our brain believe it actually happened; and social influence, where suggestions from trusted people can implant entirely new memories into our consciousness. Even more remarkably, false memories can be induced in laboratory settings through techniques like the Dies-Roediger-McDermott paradigm, where people are exposed to lists of related words and subsequently falsely remember words that were never presented but are semantically related to the actual words they heard. Imagine walking into a room in your own home, a space you have inhabited for years, and suddenly everything feels completely foreign and unfamiliar, as though you have never seen it before in your entire life. The furniture, the arrangement of objects, the walls themselves seem to belong to some strange place you cannot quite recognize, despite the logical part of your mind knowing with absolute certainty that you have been here thousands of times. This disorienting phenomenon is called jamais vu, which is French for never seen, and it stands as the peculiar inverse of its more famous counterpart, déjà vu. While déjà vu creates the sensation of having experienced something new before, jamais vu strips away familiarity from things you know intimately, leaving you in a temporary state of cognitive bewilderment. The experience typically lasts only seconds or minutes, but in that brief window, the world around you becomes mysteriously alien. Neuroscientists believe this occurs due to temporary disruptions in the brain's memory retrieval systems, specifically in the regions responsible for recognition and familiarity assessment. When these neural pathways become momentarily desynchronized, the brain fails to access the accumulated memories associated with a familiar place or person, causing the cognitive system to treat old information as brand new. This glitch in recognition is thought to happen more frequently than people realize, though most instances are so subtle that we scarcely notice them. What makes jamais vu particularly fascinating is that despite understanding logically what we are looking at, our emotional and intuitive brain systems refuse to confirm that understanding, creating an internal conflict that generates genuine unease and confusion. Scientists hypothesize that stress, fatigue, and divided attention can increase the likelihood of these strange lapses, as mental resources become redirected away from the automatic processes that maint. Have you ever remembered a childhood event with vivid clarity, only to have a family member correct you with an entirely different version of what actually happened, leaving you genuinely confused about which memory is real? This phenomenon, known as confabulation, represents one of the most fascinating and unsettling quirks of human memory, wherein our brains unconsciously fill in gaps in our recollection with fabricated details that feel absolutely authentic to us. When we attempt to recall an event from our past, our brain does not retrieve a complete recording like a video camera might. Instead, it reconstructs the memory from fragmented pieces, emotional impressions, and contextual information scattered throughout our neural networks. In the process of this reconstruction, our minds naturally fill in the missing pieces, not out of conscious deception, but rather as an automatic mechanism designed to create a coherent narrative that makes sense given what we do remember. The remarkable aspect of confabulation is that these invented details are not recognized as false by the person experiencing them. The individual genuinely believes their confabulated memory is accurate, and they can describe it with confidence and emotional authenticity. This occurs because the brain's memory systems and its belief systems become intertwined, such that once a memory is reconstructed and integrated into our personal narrative, it becomes neurologically indistinguishable from a factually accurate recollection. Confabulation happens to everyone, regardless of intelligence or education level, suggesting that it is not a sign of dishonesty or cognitive failure, but rather an inevitable consequence of how human memory actually works. The brain prioritizes creating meaningful narratives and maintaining psychological coherence over preserving perfect factual accuracy, which means that distorting minor details becomes an acceptable trade-off for maintaining a stable S. Imagine sitting in a coffee shop and overhearing a conversation that sparks what feels like a brilliant, original idea in your mind, an idea so perfectly formed and novel that you become convinced it emerged fresh from your own creative consciousness. Yet hours later, or perhaps days afterward, you suddenly remember that you had encountered this exact same thought in a book you read months ago or in a documentary you watched years earlier, and in that moment of recognition, you realize with a strange mixture of embarrassment and fascination that your mind had unconsciously absorbed and stored this information without your awareness, only to retrieve it later and present it to your conscious mind as though it were a product of your own original thinking rather than a retrieval from memory. This phenomenon is known as cryptomnesia, derived from the Greek words for hidden and memory, and it represents one of the most peculiar quirks of human cognition, whereby information becomes encoded in our long-term memory without conscious recollection of the source material, creating a situation where we unknowingly plagiarize our own forgotten experiences. The mechanism behind cryptomnesia involves the distinction between source memory and content memory, two separate cognitive systems that do not always operate in perfect synchronization with one another. Content memory refers to our ability to recall the actual information itself, the facts or ideas or creative concepts we have encountered, while source memory refers to our ability to remember where and when and how we originally came across that information. And when these two systems become decoupled or misaligned, we retain the content while losing access to its source, leading us to believe we generated the idea ourselves rather than retrieved it from somewhere else. Have you ever found yourself speaking in complete sentences while lying in bed, your eyes closed and your conscious mind seemingly absent from the conversation, only to have someone inform you the next morning that you spent 20 minutes discussing grocery lists or arguing about traffic routes? Sleep talking, or somnoloquy as it is formally known, represents one of those peculiar human experiences where the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness becomes remarkably blurred, allowing verbal communication to emerge from a mind that is ostensibly at rest. The phenomenon typically manifests as sporadic utterances ranging from simple mumbles and incoherent sounds to elaborate dialogues that can seem perfectly logical to an outside listener, even though the person producing these words has no memory of the experience whatsoever and no conscious intention of speaking at all. The behavior can occur during any stage of sleep, though it is most commonly observed during the lighter stages of non-rapid eye movement sleep and during REM sleep, when vivid dreams are most prevalent and neurological activity in the brain mimics patterns similar to wakefulness. From a neurological perspective, sleep talking occurs because certain regions of the brain remain partially activated during sleep, particularly those areas associated with language production and motor control, while simultaneously the brain regions responsible for logical editing, self-awareness, and decision-making remain suppressed or offline. This creates a peculiar dissociation where the mechanisms for speech remain functional even as the conscious mind has relinquished control, allowing whatever thoughts, memories, emotions, or fragmented dreams are cycling through the sleeping brain to be vocalized without any filter or deliberation. Imagine the peculiar sensation of lying in bed, eyes closed, yet somehow aware that you are dreaming while the dream itself continues to unfold around you. A strange recursive consciousness where you observe your own subconscious creation with waking clarity, able to make decisions and alter the dream landscape while simultaneously remaining asleep. A phenomenon that has fascinated human beings across cultures and centuries and continues to perplex neuroscientists who study the exact mechanisms by which the brain can maintain awareness while operating in sleep mode. During a lucid dream, a person becomes cognizant of the dream state itself, often gaining the ability to control elements of the dream, fly through impossible skies, conjure people or places from memory, or simply observe the dream narrative with a sense of detached awareness that would otherwise be impossible during ordinary dreaming when the brain typically lacks this reflective capacity. The mechanism behind lucid dreaming appears to involve a unique pattern of neural activity in which certain regions associated with self-awareness and metacognition remain partially activated even as the brain enters the REM sleep stage where most vivid dreams occur, essentially creating a hybrid state of consciousness that bridges sleeping and waking awareness in ways that typical sleep architecture would not normally permit. Neurotransmitter levels, particularly those involving serotonin and acetylcholine, appear to shift in ways that preserve frontal lobe function related to reasoning and executive decision-making, while maintaining the visual imagery and emotional engagement of the dreaming brain, allowing consciousness to bifurcate into both observer and participant simultaneously. Despite having no obvious evolutionary advantage and consuming no less energy than regular dreaming, lucid dreaming persists as a natural capacity in many humans, suggesting that consciousness itself possesses. During the deepest phases of sleep, specifically during what neuroscientists call the REM stage, which stands for rapid eye movement sleep, your body enters a state of profound neurological contradiction where your mind becomes intensely active while your muscles remain almost completely paralyzed. And yet, despite this natural mechanism of protection, many people experience episodes where they act out their dreams with startling physical movements, thrashing limbs, shouting, or even climbing from their beds while remaining partially asleep. This phenomenon, known as REM sleep behavior disorder, occurs when the normal muscle atonia that should accompany dreaming fails to activate properly, allowing the motor cortex signals that create dream narratives to translate directly into waking world movements. The brain during REM sleep shows activation patterns remarkably similar to waking consciousness in many regions, particularly those involved in visual imagery, emotion, and narrative construction. Yet the pontine tegmentum, a region in the brainstem, typically sends inhibitory signals down the spinal cord that prevent any motor output from actually reaching the muscles, essentially paralyzing the body while the mind dreams. When this inhibitory mechanism malfunctions due to neurological conditions, medication side effects, or sometimes without any clear cause, the dreamer's physical body becomes a puppet responding to the storylines unfolding in their unconscious mind. People might find themselves punching imaginary attackers, fleeing from dream dangers, or engaging in elaborate physical sequences they have no conscious memory of performing. What makes this behavior particularly strange is that we have evolved this exact system of paralysis during dreams as a protective mechanism. Yet many people never experience REM sleep behavior disorder at all, while others find themselves regularly enacting dangerous scenarios that could result in serious in. Imagine waking in the dead of night, your heart pounding violently against your ribs, your body drenched in sweat, and an overwhelming sense of absolute terror flooding through your consciousness. Yet when you fully awaken moments later, you remember nothing of what caused such primal fear to grip you so intensely. This is the experience of night terrors, a sleep phenomenon that strikes without warning and leaves sufferers confused and shaken, unsure of what they experienced or why their bodies reacted with such extreme distress. Night terrors differ fundamentally from nightmares in that the person experiences intense fear and physical panic during the non-REM sleep stage, typically occurring within the first few hours of sleep when the brain is cycling through deep sleep phases. And upon waking, there is usually no clear dream memory, only the lingering physiological aftermath of pure panic. During a night terror episode, the amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center, becomes hyperactive while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and conscious awareness, remains largely offline, creating a disconnect where the body experiences extreme threat detection while the conscious mind cannot process or contextualize what is happening. The individual may thrash, scream, or attempt to flee, displaying behaviors that suggest they are confronting a genuine danger, yet no external threat exists, and the episode typically resolves on its own within minutes as the brain transitions to a different sleep stage. Scientists theorize that night terrors represent a malfunction in sleep-wake transitions, where the brain becomes partially aroused but gets stuck in a state where fear circuits are activated while the logical centers remain dormant, much like a security system triggering an alarm without any actual intrusion. Deep within the landscape of sleep disorders lies a phenomenon as unusual as it is deeply personal, one that occurs when the boundaries between consciousness and unconsciousness blur in the most intimate of ways. Sexsomnia, formerly known as sleep-related sexual behavior disorder, describes instances where individuals engage in sexual activity while in a state of sleep, ranging from subtle movements and vocalizations to more overt and deliberate physical interactions with a bed partner. The person experiencing these episodes remains largely unconscious during the event, with little to no memory of what has transpired once they awaken, leaving both the affected individual and their partner in states of confusion and often emotional distress. These episodes typically occur during the deeper stages of non-REM sleep, the same phases that produce sleepwalking and sleep talking, where the brain's executive functions and conscious awareness remain largely offline while certain motor pathways remain partially active. The underlying mechanism appears to involve a disconnection between the limbic system, which governs emotional and sexual responses, and the prefrontal cortex, which normally exercises judgment and behavioral control during waking hours. When this neural communication breaks down during sleep, the brain essentially activates sexual responses without the conscious awareness or intentional participation of the sleeping individual. Contributing factors include sleep deprivation, stress, alcohol consumption, certain medications, and pre-existing sleep disorders such as sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome, all of which can fragment sleep architecture and create the conditions where such episodes become more likely. Despite our advanced understanding of neurology and sleep science, sexsomnia remains remarkably common yet profoundly stigmatized, with many sufferers reluctant to disclose the condition even to medical professionals due to shame and embarrassment. Have you ever found yourself standing in front of the refrigerator at 2 in the morning, consuming an entire container of ice cream or a stack of leftover pizza without any genuine hunger driving the behavior, only to feel a strange mixture of satisfaction and regret as you return to bed? This phenomenon, known as nocturnal eating, represents one of the most perplexing intersections between our biological rhythms and our psychological relationship with food, manifesting in ways that seem entirely disconnected from the rational needs of our bodies. During the day, most people maintain some semblance of control over their eating habits, guided by social conventions, work schedules, and the awareness that others might observe their choices. Yet when darkness falls and the household quiets, something shifts in the human psyche that loosens these restraints and invites us toward the kitchen with an almost magnetic pull. The mechanism driving this behavior operates on multiple levels simultaneously, beginning with the circadian disruption that occurs when we remain awake during hours when our bodies expect to be resting, which creates a kind of biological confusion where hunger hormones like ghrelin become dysregulated and our capacity to recognize satiety signals diminishes substantially. Beyond the purely biological explanation lies a deeply psychological component, as nighttime often represents a window of privacy and freedom from judgment, a liminal space where the self we present to others during daylight hours can be temporarily suspended, and food becomes not merely nutrition, but rather a form of comfort, control, and emotional regulation during moments when stress, anxiety, or loneliness feels most acute and difficult to manage through other means. Imagine stepping outside on a bright, sunny day after being indoors in dim light, and suddenly you feel an irresistible urge to sneeze building in your nasal passages, a tickling sensation that grows more insistent with each passing second, until finally your body convulses in an involuntary sneeze, leaving you momentarily disoriented and wondering why the sun itself seemed to trigger such a response from your body. This peculiar phenomenon, known as the photic sneeze reflex, affects approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the human population, though many people remain completely unaware they possess this sensitivity, experiencing it so regularly that it has become merely another unremarkable aspect of their daily existence. The mechanism behind this strange reflex operates through an unusual neurological pathway, one that remains somewhat mysterious to science despite decades of study and investigation by researchers seeking to understand its origins and purpose. When light enters your eyes at sufficient brightness and intensity, the optical nerves transmit signals to your brain, and somewhere in the complex processing of this visual information, there appears to be a misfiring or inadvertent triggering of the trigeminal nerve, the same nerve responsible for detecting irritation in your nasal passages and orchestrating the sneezing response. Rather than the light directly causing the sneeze, the leading theory suggests that the sudden brightness causes your pupils to constrict rapidly, and this muscular contraction sends signals that somehow become confused with or amplified into genuine nasal irritation signals, compelling your nervous system to execute a full sneeze response even though no actual irritant has entered your respiratory system. Have you ever noticed that certain sounds and whispered voices seem to trigger a tingling sensation that starts at the back of your head and travels down your spine? A feeling so pleasant and relaxing that it makes your eyelids grow heavy and your breathing slow down to match the gentle pace of the stimulus around you. This phenomenon, known as Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response or ASMR, has become increasingly prevalent in our modern world, with millions of people deliberately seeking out videos of someone whispering softly, tapping on surfaces, crinkling paper, or brushing hair, all in pursuit of that elusive tingling sensation and the deep relaxation that accompanies it. The science behind ASMR appears to involve the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of your body responsible for rest and digestion, triggered by specific auditory and visual stimuli that your brain has learned to associate with safety, comfort, and attention from another person. When you hear a soft voice speaking directly to you, or watch someone performing careful, methodical movements with precision and care, your brain interprets these as signals of a nurturing presence, much like the feeling you might have experienced as a child when someone cared for you with undivided attention and gentle touch. The tingling sensation itself, though not yet fully understood by neuroscience, appears to involve the release of relaxation chemicals and a slight activation of the somatosensory cortex, the brain region responsible for processing touch sensations. What makes ASMR particularly fascinating is how it persists and grows despite its relatively recent naming and scientific study, as people continue to seek out these videos and sounds not necessarily because they understand the mechanism, but because the effect is undeniably real and deeply soothing to those who experience it, representing yet another strange way that our bodies respond to the world around us. Have you ever listened to a particular song or musical passage and felt an inexplicable shiver run down your spine, a tingling sensation across your scalp, or a sudden rush of goosebumps spreading across your arms and neck? This phenomenon, often described as frisson or musical chills, is a deeply peculiar human experience that occurs when we encounter something orally beautiful or emotionally resonant. The sensation typically builds gradually as the music progresses, often arriving at a crescendo, an unexpected harmonic shift, or a moment of profound lyrical meaning, and then it subsides just as mysteriously as it came. What makes this experience particularly fascinating is that it appears to be entirely subjective, varying dramatically from person to person based on their individual musical preferences, life experiences, and emotional states. Scientists have discovered that music-induced chills activate the same reward centers in the brain that respond to food, drugs, or physical pleasure, flooding the system with dopamine and creating a genuine neurochemical event. The body's response involves the autonomic nervous system, the very system that controls our fight or flight responses. Yet in this case, it triggers neither danger nor survival instinct, but rather something closer to aesthetic transcendence. Furthermore, research suggests that people who experience musical chills tend to have greater connectivity between auditory regions and areas associated with emotional processing and self-referential thinking, meaning their brains are literally wired differently to perceive and integrate musical meaning. What remains remarkable is that despite understanding the neurochemistry involved, the subjective magic of the experience persists entirely unchanged, as if knowing the mechanism somehow diminishes nothing of the wonder, and we continue to seek out those precise moments of musical beauty with the same yearning and anticipation as if the S. You wake up in the morning with a melody stuck in your head, the same few bars of a song repeating endlessly like a broken record player, and no matter how hard you try to think of something else, the tune persists with an almost maddening determination, playing over and over again throughout your day while you attempt to focus on work or conversation or any other task requiring your full attention. This phenomenon, known as an earworm or involuntary musical imagery, is something that most people experience multiple times per week, yet it remains one of the most mysteriously persistent quirks of human cognition that we have come to accept as simply part of being alive. The experience typically begins when you have heard a particular song recently, whether it was playing in a store, stuck in your head from a commercial, or deliberately listened to just before going to bed, and your brain somehow decides that this melodic pattern is important enough to keep replaying without your consent or conscious effort. Scientists have discovered that earworms activate the same neural pathways involved in actual musical perception and memory, meaning that your brain is essentially playing a concert for itself, generating auditory sensations that feel remarkably real even though no sound is actually reaching your ears. The mechanisms behind this appear to involve the interaction between your auditory cortex, which processes sound, and your memory systems, which store musical information, creating a kind of neurological feedback loop where the mental replay of music becomes self-reinforcing and difficult to interrupt once it has begun. What makes earworms particularly fascinating is that they tend to be most common in people who are musically trained or who listen to music frequently, suggesting that our brains are simply exercising their musical pathways, yet they also occur in people with no musical training whatsoever, indicating that this capacity for involuntary. Have you ever repeated a word so many times that it suddenly loses all meaning, becoming nothing more than a strange collection of sounds in your mouth, completely divorced from the concept it once represented? Perhaps you said the word chair over and over again until it became utterly meaningless, and you found yourself wondering if you had ever truly known what a chair was at all. This peculiar phenomenon is called semantic satiation, and it represents one of the most fascinating ways that our brains can temporarily malfunction through sheer repetition. When you encounter a word or concept repeatedly in quick succession, the neurons in your brain that are responsible for processing that particular meaning become fatigued, much like muscles that have been overworked at the gym. This neural fatigue causes the specific brain regions associated with that semantic information to become less responsive, effectively dampening the signal that connects the sound or visual representation of the word to its actual meaning. The more you repeat the word, the more pronounced this effect becomes, until the word feels almost foreign and strange, as though you are encountering it for the very first time. Scientists have discovered that this effect typically lasts only a few seconds to a few minutes, and the meaning returns to normal once you stop repeating the word and allow those tired neural pathways to recover. What makes semantic satiation particularly intriguing is that it reveals how meaning itself is not something fixed and immutable in our minds, but rather something that depends entirely on the current state of our neural circuitry, fluctuating based on recent patterns of activation and the metabolic state of the neurons involved in processing information. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation where you know exactly what you want to say, and the word sits just beyond your conscious reach, hovering at the edges of your mind like a name you absolutely should remember but cannot quite grasp, no matter how hard you concentrate or how many similar words you cycle through, all while experiencing that distinctive sensation of knowing that you know the answer? This is the tip-of-tongue phenomenon, a universal cognitive experience where information exists in your memory but remains temporarily inaccessible to conscious retrieval despite your considerable mental effort and awareness that the knowledge is indeed stored somewhere within your brain. The mechanism behind this frustrating experience involves the distinction between knowing information at an implicit level and being able to consciously access it. As your brain stores vast networks of interconnected semantic and phonetic information that sometimes become partially activated without allowing full conscious access to the complete word or concept you seek. When you try to retrieve a word, your brain searches through memory networks that contain information about meaning, sound, context, and usage. And occasionally these searches can activate related information and even some phonetic details about the target word, such as its first letter or number of syllables, without triggering the complete, unified representation necessary for full recall and fluent speech. The phenomenon often resolves spontaneously through what researchers call incubation, where ceasing your active efforts and allowing your mind to wander actually permits the neural networks to continue processing in the background until the complete word suddenly becomes available to consciousness, sometimes minutes or even hours after the initial frustration. Imagine yourself in a conversation where someone mentions a name, a place, or a concept, and immediately you feel an overwhelming sense that you have encountered this information before, that it exists somewhere in the depths of your memory. Yet when you reach for it consciously, it dissolves like morning mist, leaving you with nothing but the hollow certainty that you almost knew it. This is presque vu, a French term meaning almost seen, and it represents one of the most peculiar inversions of the far more famous tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon. Where tip of the tongue involves the sensation that you know something but cannot quite retrieve it, presque vu involves the conviction that you have experienced or known something without actually being able to confirm that you ever did. Your mind insists that familiarity has touched this moment before, yet no actual memory surfaces to validate the claim. The mechanism behind this strange experience lies in the complex interplay between your semantic memory systems and your phenomenological awareness, the part of your consciousness that generates the feeling of knowing. Sometimes your brain activates the neural networks associated with familiarity and recognition without simultaneously activating the specific memories that should accompany those networks, creating a mismatch between the sensation of knowing and the actual content of knowledge. This can occur when you encounter something that shares structural or conceptual similarities with past experiences, triggering a faint echo of recognition that never quite solidifies into genuine recollection. What makes presque vu particularly fascinating is that despite understanding its illusory nature, we continue to trust these sensations, repeatedly chasing the phantom memory in hopes that it will eventually materialize, even though statistically it rarely does. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation where someone says something hurtful or insulting, and in that moment your mind goes blank, your thoughts scatter like leaves in wind, and you stand there searching desperately for a witty comeback or a devastating response that would perfectly deflate the other person's arrogance, only to discover that nothing comes to mind, and so you remain silent, feeling small and defeated. Only to have the perfect response materialize in your consciousness hours later when you are alone, perhaps climbing the stairs to your bedroom or walking through your home, and by then it is far too late to deliver it, leaving you with an acute sense of frustration and regret at having missed the opportunity. This phenomenon is called l'esprit de l'escalier, a French phrase that translates literally to the spirit of the staircase, and it describes this peculiar human experience of thinking of the right thing to say only after the moment has passed. The mechanism behind this occurrence involves the way our brains process social threat and cognitive load during moments of interpersonal conflict or tension. When we are confronted with a challenging or insulting remark, our bodies enter a state of heightened alert, releasing stress hormones that can actually impair our working memory and creative thinking, making it difficult to access our full reservoir of vocabulary and wit while the pressure is on. The prefrontal cortex, which handles abstract reasoning and quick thinking, becomes somewhat suppressed under this acute stress, while our amygdala, the emotional center, takes over, pushing us toward fight, flight, or freeze responses. Only later, when our nervous system has calmed down and we are no longer in the presence of the social threat, does our brain have the cognitive resources to replay the conversation and generate clever, articulate responses that our stressed mind simply could not access before. Have you ever felt your phone vibrate in your pocket, only to pull it out and discover nothing there, no notification waiting, no message arriving, just the empty screen of a device that never actually buzzed at all? You stand there for a moment, confused, wondering if you imagine the sensation, before sliding it back into your pocket and resuming whatever you were doing, chalking it up to your mind playing tricks on you. This experience, repeated countless times across millions of people in the modern world, is known as phantom vibration syndrome, a peculiar neurological phenomenon that highlights the remarkable sensitivity of our sensory systems and the way our brains have adapted to constant technological stimulation. The syndrome occurs because our skin and nerves have become so attuned to the specific frequency and pattern of vibrations produced by our mobile devices that our brains can misinterpret random environmental stimuli as incoming messages, creating a vivid sensation of a vibration that never actually occurred. When you carry a phone regularly, your nervous system becomes conditioned to expect vibrations in that specific location, and your brain essentially learns to predict and anticipate these signals with such precision that it can manufacture the sensation internally without any actual external trigger. Studies suggest that the more frequently you check your phone and the more you anticipate notifications, the more likely you are to experience phantom vibrations, as your brain enters a state of heightened vigilance, constantly scanning for signals that might indicate social contact or important information. This phenomenon persists despite being entirely illogical because it emerges from the depths of our evolutionary psychology, from systems in our brain that develop to help us detect subtle environmental changes and social cues, systems that have now been hijacked by our modern technological habits. Have you ever been sitting in complete silence, perhaps working at your desk or relaxing at home, when suddenly you hear the unmistakable sound of your phone ringing? You immediately reach for it, check the screen with anticipation, only to discover that your phone has not rung at all, that no call is coming through, and that the ringing sound exists only in your mind. This experience, known as phantom ringing, is a peculiar auditory hallucination that affects millions of people across the globe, particularly those who have grown accustomed to carrying smartphones and waiting anxiously for notifications from others. The phenomenon is so common that researchers have documented it extensively, finding that upwards of 89% of people who regularly use mobile devices have experienced this sensation at least once in their lives, with some individuals reporting it happening multiple times per week or even daily. The phantom ringing typically manifests as a distinct, realistic sound that perfectly mimics the actual ringtone or vibration pattern of the device, complete with all the auditory qualities that would normally accompany a genuine incoming call or message notification. The mechanism behind phantom ringing involves a concept known as pareidolia combined with expectancy bias, which occurs when your brain becomes so attuned to anticipating a particular stimulus that it essentially manufactures that stimulus from random background noise or even pure silence. Your brain has been primed through repetition and conditioning to expect these notifications, and when you are in a state of heightened alertness or waiting for communication from someone important, your neural pathways become hyperactive in the auditory processing regions. This heightened state of anticipation creates a kind of auditory false positive, where your brain detects patterns that match what it has been trained to recognize as a phone notification, even when no actual S. Consider the moment when you glance at your bedroom wall at night and suddenly perceive a face staring back at you from the shadows and textures, or when you look at the front of a car and see a distinct expression in the arrangement of headlights and grille, or when you notice a face formed by clouds drifting across the sky. Each of these experiences representing an instance of pareidolia, specifically the remarkable tendency of your brain to recognize faces in completely random and inanimate patterns. This phenomenon occurs because your brain possesses an extraordinarily powerful facial recognition system that has been honed by millions of years of evolution, a system so finely tuned that it will activate even when presented with minimal or ambiguous visual information, essentially erring on the side of caution by defaulting to face recognition whenever the available stimuli remotely resemble the basic characteristics of human features. When your visual cortex encounters any pattern containing two roughly circular shapes positioned vertically, separated by space, with perhaps a horizontal line below them, your brain instantly interprets this arrangement as a face, triggering the same neural pathways that activate when you encounter an actual person, and this occurs automatically without conscious deliberation or control. The evolutionary advantage of this hair trigger response becomes apparent when you consider that throughout human history, The cost of missing a face, particularly a threatening one, was far greater than the cost of occasionally seeing faces that do not exist, meaning that natural selection favored brains that would recognize faces even in ambiguous situations rather than fail to notice a genuine threat or potential ally. This neurological mechanism has become so deeply embedded in human perception that we continue to see faces in toasters, trees, and rock formations, despite consciously knowing these objects contain no actual. Have you ever felt genuinely sad when throwing away a broken toy, or found yourself apologizing to your car when you accidentally kick it, or perhaps spoken to your houseplants as though they could understand your words and respond to your emotional state? These are all examples of anthropomorphizing objects, the deeply human tendency to attribute human characteristics, emotions, intentions, and consciousness to non-human things around us, whether they are animals, plants, weather patterns, or inanimate objects entirely devoid of any biological capacity for thought or feeling. When you personify your coffee maker by calling it finicky or temperamental, or when you feel that your phone is angry with you because it keeps freezing and crashing, you are engaging in a cognitive process that is far more universal and persistent than most people realize, crossing cultures, age groups, and educational backgrounds with remarkable consistency. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior appears to be rooted in how our brains are fundamentally wired to recognize patterns and detect agency in the world around us. A survival adaptation that helped our ancestors quickly identify threats and opportunities in their environment. Our pattern recognition systems are so powerful and so eager to find meaning that they sometimes misfire, creating the perception of intention and consciousness even in objects that clearly possess neither the neural structures nor the biological substrate necessary for any form of awareness or understanding. When we see a face in the clouds or in the arrangement of knots on a tree trunk, our brains are applying the same cognitive machinery that evolved to help us recognize actual human faces in crowds and detect social cues from other people. And this same overly sensitive system extends to objects we interact with regularly. Have you ever found yourself cursing at your computer when it freezes, or gently coaxing your car to start on a cold morning, or perhaps offering words of encouragement to your phone as it struggles to load an application? This seemingly irrational behavior of speaking to inanimate objects is far more universal than most people realize, and it occurs across cultures and age groups with remarkable consistency. People talk to their devices, their furniture, their pets, their plants, and even to abstract concepts like luck or fate, often in moments of frustration, affection, or desperation. The behavior manifests in countless ways. A parent might whisper reassurances to a temperamental appliance, a student might thank their computer for not crashing during an important exam, or someone might scold an object for malfunctioning as if it had willfully chosen to disappoint them. The underlying mechanism behind this behavior appears rooted in our fundamental human tendency to anthropomorphize, which is our natural inclination to attribute human characteristics, emotions, and intentionality to non-human entities. When we talk to objects, we are essentially engaging in a form of magical thinking that dates back to our evolutionary past, a time when our ancestors needed to navigate an unpredictable world by imbuing objects and forces with agency and personality. From a neurological perspective, when we address objects as if they possess consciousness or intention, we activate the same social cognition networks in our brains that we use when communicating with other people. And this activation can actually make us feel more connected to our environment and more in control of our circumstances. The practice also serves practical psychological functions, as verbalizing our frustrations or hopes can help us regulate our emotions and maintain a sense of agency in situations where we might otherwise feel powerless. Consider the peculiar experience of sitting alone in your car, waiting for an appointment, when suddenly you find yourself having a full conversation with yourself about something that happened earlier in the day, rehearsing arguments you might never have, or narrating your own actions as though you are the host of a nature documentary, observing your own behavior from an outside perspective. This internal monologue, the constant stream of language and thought that runs through our minds throughout our waking hours, represents one of the most fundamental yet utterly strange aspects of human consciousness that we rarely stop to examine. From the moment we wake until we fall asleep, most of us maintain an almost uninterrupted dialogue with ourselves, commenting on our surroundings, replaying conversations, planning future interactions, or simply narrating the mundane details of our existence in real time. The psychological mechanism behind this behavior appears to be rooted in our brain's need to organize and process information through language, a uniquely human capacity that emerged alongside our development of complex communication systems. When we engage in internal monologue, our prefrontal cortex becomes actively engaged in a form of self-directed speech that allows us to organize thoughts, plan actions, work through emotional conflicts, and maintain a sense of continuity in our identity and narrative. This internal voice becomes so much a part of our experience that we treat it as synonymous with our very consciousness itself, yet it remains largely invisible to us until we pause to notice it. What makes this behavior particularly strange is that we maintain these conversations with ourselves despite knowing that we are both the speaker and the listener, that we already know what we are going to say before we say it, and that this elaborate internal performance serves purposes we do not fully understand. Imagine you are standing on a high balcony, looking out at the city below, when suddenly and without warning, a disturbing thought flashes through your mind. What if you jumped? Or perhaps you are holding your newborn child, filled with love and tenderness, when an unwanted violent image appears unbidden in your consciousness, causing immediate distress and confusion. You might be in a quiet meeting at work when an embarrassing memory surfaces, or when you inexplicably imagine saying something completely inappropriate to your boss, even though you would never do such a thing. These sudden, unwanted, and often disturbing thoughts that appear without invitation are called intrusive thoughts, and they represent one of the most common yet misunderstood aspects of human consciousness. The mechanism behind intrusive thoughts involves the way our brains work to constantly scan our environment for potential threats and problems. Our minds generate thousands of thoughts per day, many of which are random associations, creative combinations of memories, and hypothetical scenarios that our brains construct as a form of threat assessment and planning. Most of these thoughts are immediately dismissed and forgotten because our conscious attention simply does not register them, but occasionally a thought emerges that captures our attention because it seems shocking, wrong, or contradictory to our values and beliefs. When this happens, we become hyper-aware of the thought, we assign it meaning and importance, and paradoxically, this very act of resistance and distress strengthens the neural pathway associated with that thought, making it more likely to resurface again. The phenomenon persists despite having no logical connection to our actual intentions or character, because the more we try to suppress a thought, the more our brain becomes primed to notice similar thoughts in the future, a process known as thought rebound. Consider a moment when you make a small mistake at work, perhaps sending an email with a typo or stumbling slightly over your words during a meeting, and within seconds your mind floods with a cascade of darker interpretations about what this means for your future, your competence, and how others perceive you, spiraling into thoughts that your colleagues now think you are incompetent, that you will surely be passed over for promotion, that you are fundamentally flawed in some way. Even though rationally you know that one minor error is completely normal and happens to everyone regularly throughout the day. This phenomenon, known as automatic negative thoughts, represents one of the most pervasive patterns in human psychology, where the mind reflexively generates pessimistic interpretations of events, often without conscious decision or deliberate reasoning on your part. The mechanism behind this behavior roots itself deep in our evolutionary history, when our ancestors needed to constantly scan their environment for potential threats and dangers in order to survive in a world filled with predators and natural hazards. And this threat detection system became so efficient and automatic that it began firing even in response to minor social embarrassments or small failures that posed no actual danger whatsoever. Over time, this survival mechanism became hardwired into our neural pathways, creating a cognitive bias where the mind habitually leans toward worst-case scenarios and catastrophic thinking patterns as a kind of protective mechanism. Even though in our modern world of relative safety and stability, this protective system causes far more suffering than it prevents through constant rumination and worry. What makes automatic negative thoughts particularly persistent despite their illogical nature is that they feel absolutely true in the moment. They arrive with such speed and conviction that we rarely question them or examine them. Have you ever found yourself lying in bed at 3 in the morning, replaying a conversation from years ago, analyzing every word you said, every facial expression you made, convinced that you ruined a friendship or embarrassed yourself beyond repair, only to realize hours have passed and you are no closer to resolution than when you started. This is rumination, one of the most persistent and peculiar behaviors of the human mind, a cyclical pattern of thinking in which we become trapped in repetitive thoughts about problems, regrets, or anxieties without ever actually moving toward a solution. The experience feels urgent and necessary, as though by thinking about the problem enough times, examining it from every possible angle, we might finally understand what went wrong or discover a hidden way to fix it. Yet the thinking itself becomes the problem rather than the path to an answer. Neuroscientifically, rumination appears to involve the default mode network of the brain, a system that activates when we are not focused on external tasks, allowing our minds to wander inward towards self-referential thinking and autobiographical memory. When we ruminate, we essentially activate this network on repeat, with our prefrontal cortex reinforcing connections between negative thoughts and emotional responses, creating neural pathways that become easier to activate each time we think the troubling thought. The behavior persists because it feels productive, because our brains have evolved to problem solve and to worry about social threats and personal failures, which are legitimate concerns in human survival and social belonging. However, rumination hijacks this adaptive mechanism, transforming it into a maladaptive loop in which the brain mistakes the act of thinking about the problem for actually solving it, creating a false sense of agency and control that keeps us returning to the same thoughts again and again, unable to break free from the cycle even as you find yourself lying in bed at night, replaying a conversation from earlier in the day, and suddenly you notice that one awkward pause you made when speaking to a colleague, and you begin to wonder if they thought you were strange, and then you spiral into imagining how that moment might have damaged your professional reputation. And before you know it, you are constructing elaborate narratives about how this single pause might eventually lead to your dismissal from your job, financial ruin, and complete social isolation. All stemming from a few seconds of silence that the other person has almost certainly already forgotten. This phenomenon of overthinking spirals represents one of the most peculiar yet widespread patterns of human cognition, where a single thought becomes a gateway into an increasingly abstract and catastrophic chain of reasoning that bears little resemblance to reality. The mechanism behind this behavior lies in how our brains process uncertainty and threat. When we encounter an ambiguous social situation or an unresolved problem, our minds naturally attempt to resolve that ambiguity by generating possible explanations and outcomes. But because the situation is genuinely unclear, our brains must fill in the gaps with speculation. This speculation often takes a pessimistic turn because our ancestors survived by assuming worst-case scenarios, and that ancient survival mechanism still runs beneath our consciousness today. Each thought triggers associations with related concerns and anxieties, creating a network of interconnected worries that feed into one another, each one seemingly logical in isolation, but collectively forming a baroque structure of dread that has no basis in the actual evidence available to us. What makes overthinking spirals particularly strange is that we rarely believe our own catastrophic narratives while we are experiencing them, yet we cannot seem to stop generating them anyway. Picture this common scenario. You finish work after a long, exhausting day where your time belonged entirely to your employer, your clients, your meetings, and your responsibilities, and you arrive home feeling completely drained of autonomy and personal agency. You know you need sleep because tomorrow demands the same early wake-up time and the same relentless schedule, yet instead of heading directly to bed, you find yourself scrolling through your phone, watching videos, or engaging in some form of entertainment that keeps you awake well past midnight, deliberately stealing time from your future rest. This behavior has acquired the name revenge bedtime procrastination, a phenomenon that emerged prominently in the 21st century, particularly in cultures with rigid work schedules and limited personal time. The psychological mechanism underlying this strange choice involves a fundamental human need for autonomy and control. Throughout the day, your time has been parceled out and managed by external forces, leaving you feeling as though you have lost ownership of your own life and choices. When evening finally arrives and bedtime approaches, the only time that remains truly yours is the time you can steal from sleep itself. And so you wage a form of rebellion against the constraints of your day by deliberately choosing to stay awake, reclaiming those hours as a personal victory against the system that has dominated your waking hours. The irony, of course, is that this revenge comes at an enormous cost to your own well-being, creating a cycle of sleep deprivation that makes the following day even more exhausting and the need for autonomy even more desperate. Despite understanding logically that sacrificing sleep serves no one and only amplifies fatigue and reduces your actual capacity for enjoyment during those late-night hours, the act persists as a form of psychological protest against time not freely chosen. We find ourselves in the evening hours, perhaps preparing for sleep, when we pick up our phones with what feels like innocent intention, only to discover ourselves an hour later still scrolling through an endless feed of catastrophic headlines, environmental disasters, political upheaval, and human suffering. This compulsive consumption of exclusively negative news and distressing content has become so prevalent that it now carries its own name: doom scrolling. The behavior typically begins without conscious decision, a simple reflex action born from habit and the algorithmic design of social media platforms that prioritize engagement above all else. We scroll downward, our thumbs moving in rhythmic motions, watching as stories of tragedy and crisis accumulate before our eyes, each headline more unsettling than the last, yet we find ourselves unable to look away or disengage from the stream. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior involves a complex interplay of cognitive biases and emotional regulation gone awry. Our brains are inherently drawn to negative information through what psychologists call negativity bias, an evolutionary adaptation that once kept our ancestors alert to threats and dangers within their environment. When we doom scroll, this ancient survival mechanism becomes hijacked by our modern digital landscape, where algorithmic systems have learned that distressing content generates the most engagement, the most shares, the most emotional reactions that keep users tethered to their screens. Additionally, there exists a paradoxical sense of control we feel when consuming negative news, as though by remaining informed about catastrophes and crises, we somehow maintain agency over an increasingly chaotic world. What makes doom scrolling particularly difficult to resist is that it masquerades as productive awareness, a form of responsible citizenship, when in reality the information we consume rarely translates into meaning. When faced with overwhelming deadlines, relationship conflicts, financial worries, or professional disappointments, many people find themselves drawn inexplicably toward the kitchen, reaching for snacks, comfort foods, or entire meals despite having no physical hunger whatsoever. They might devour an entire bag of chips while sitting at their desk, consume multiple chocolate bars during an anxious evening, or order takeout food they do not actually crave simply because their mind and body feel trapped in a state of emotional distress. This phenomenon, known as stress eating or emotional eating, represents one of the most common yet paradoxical human responses to psychological pressure, occurring across cultures and age groups with remarkable consistency. The mechanism underlying this behavior involves a complex interplay between the nervous system, hormonal pathways, and deeply ingrained emotional associations that our brains have formed since childhood. When the body experiences stress, the hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, triggering a cascade of physiological responses that ultimately elevate cortisol levels throughout the bloodstream. Elevated cortisol, while helpful for immediate fight-or-flight responses, paradoxically increases appetite and cravings for high-calorie, high-sugar, and high-fat foods that provided comfort and dopamine release during vulnerable moments in our past. The brain interprets the act of eating these foods as a form of self-soothing, rewarding itself with the same neurochemical pleasure that food-seeking behavior once offered during infancy and early childhood. What makes stress eating particularly perplexing is that it persists despite the fact that eating does absolutely nothing to resolve the underlying source of stress. Yet the temporary dopamine spike and oral stimulation create a reinforcement loop so powerful that millions of people repeat this pattern daily, creating secondary problems of W. When life becomes overwhelming or emotionally difficult, we find ourselves drawn toward specific foods that seem to soothe our distress in ways that nutritionally balanced meals simply cannot. And this peculiar human tendency to seek out comfort foods represents one of the most universal yet scientifically fascinating behaviors that bridges our biology, psychology, and early life experiences. The phenomenon typically manifests as an intense desire for foods laden with sugar, fat, or salt, items like chocolate, mac and cheese, ice cream, fried foods, or warm carbohydrate-heavy dishes, particularly during moments of stress, loneliness, boredom, or sadness, when we instinctively reach for these items as though they possess genuine healing properties. The mechanism behind comfort food cravings operates through multiple interconnected pathways within our brain and body that work together to create genuine relief from emotional distress. Beginning with the biochemical fact that foods high in sugar and fat trigger the release of dopamine and serotonin, the same neurotransmitters associated with pleasure and mood regulation that our brains are constantly seeking to maximize. Beyond simple neurochemistry, comfort foods carry profound psychological weight because they are typically linked to our earliest experiences of safety, care, and nourishment, often evoking memories of being comforted by parents or loved ones during childhood, which means that eating these foods reactivates neural pathways associated with emotional safety and belonging that formed decades earlier. The vagus nerve, a major component of our parasympathetic nervous system, responds to certain foods by triggering relaxation responses similar to those produced by meditation or deep breathing, effectively downregulating our stress response and creating genuine physiological calm that we experience as comfort. Have you ever noticed that when you feel sad, stressed, or anxious, you suddenly find yourself standing in front of the refrigerator or reaching for a bag of chips, even though you are not physically hungry? This phenomenon, known as emotional eating, is one of the most common ways that people attempt to regulate their feelings through food consumption rather than through addressing the underlying emotional state itself. When a difficult conversation leaves you feeling rejected or a work deadline creates mounting pressure in your chest, the brain searches for a rapid solution to ease that discomfort, and food becomes an accessible and socially acceptable tool for that purpose. The act of eating triggers the release of dopamine and serotonin, neurochemicals that create sensations of pleasure and temporary relief from emotional pain, making the behavior feel genuinely therapeutic in the moment. Beyond the chemical reward system, eating also activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which promotes a state of relaxation and calm, essentially mimicking the body's response to safety and comfort. Additionally, the texture and temperature of food, the ritualistic nature of preparing it, and the sensory experience of tasting it all provide a form of mindful distraction that temporarily redirects attention away from whatever emotional turmoil prompted the behavior in the first place. Yet, despite understanding that food cannot actually solve emotional problems, and that eating when not physically hungry often leads to feelings of guilt or physical discomfort afterward, millions of people continue this cycle regularly because the temporary relief is so immediate and powerful that it overrides logical reasoning. The behavior has become so normalized in modern culture that emotional eating is often treated with humor or acceptance rather than genuine curiosity about what deeper needs are going unmet, allowing the pattern to persist across generations. Consider the experience of sitting alone with a large container of ice cream or a bag of chips, consuming far more than you intended to eat, often in a state of emotional disconnection where the act becomes almost mechanical and automatic. The person may feel compelled to continue eating even as physical satiation arrives, even as discomfort sets in, driven by a force that seems to override the body's natural hunger and fullness signals. This phenomenon, known as binge eating, represents a fascinating disconnect between our rational intentions and our actual behaviors, a moment where food transforms from simple nutrition into something far more psychologically complex. The mechanism underlying binge eating operates primarily through emotional regulation systems in the brain, where eating becomes a tool for managing difficult feelings like stress, anxiety, loneliness, or sadness, rather than a response to actual physical hunger. When negative emotions arise, the brain seeks relief through dopamine release, the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward, and eating high-calorie foods triggers significant dopamine production, creating a powerful reinforcement cycle. Additionally, restrictive dieting patterns often precede binge episodes, as the brain interprets deprivation as a threat and subsequently overcorrects when presented with formerly forbidden foods, creating an intense drive to consume rapidly before the opportunity disappears. Prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and decision-making, becomes less active during these episodes, particularly when emotional distress is high, allowing more primitive reward-seeking behavior to dominate conscious experience. What persists despite this understanding is the profound shame and secrecy surrounding binge eating, which paradoxically strengthens the cycle, as emotional distress about the binge itself becomes the trigger for the next episode, creating an endless loop. Imagine sitting in a quiet room with someone you care about when they begin to chew their food, and suddenly your body floods with an overwhelming surge of rage, anxiety, and disgust so intense that you feel compelled to leave the room immediately or lash out in anger. This is the experience of someone with misophonia, a condition where specific sounds trigger an involuntary and intense emotional response that feels completely disproportionate to the actual stimulus. The person chewing is doing nothing wrong, the sound itself is ordinary and unremarkable. Yet for the misophonia sufferer, certain auditory triggers like chewing, sniffling, pen clicking, keyboard tapping, or throat clearing become nearly unbearable torment that can escalate into rage, panic, or deep emotional distress within seconds. The condition appears to involve a misfiring in the brain's emotional processing systems, where sounds that most people filter out automatically become hypersalient and directly connected to the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. When someone with misophonia hears their trigger sound, their brain essentially registers it as a genuine danger requiring an immediate defensive response, flooding the body with stress hormones and triggering the fight, flight, or freeze response even though no actual threat exists. This explains why willpower and rationality cannot override the reaction, because the response is generated at a deeply automatic level of neural processing that operates beneath conscious control. What makes misophonia particularly strange from a social perspective is how it persists despite being entirely illogical, creating fractures in relationships and forcing sufferers into increasingly isolated coping strategies. Yet it remains largely unrecognized by the general population and sometimes even by medical professionals, leaving those affected to suffer in silence while struggling to explain why they react so intensely to something. Have you ever noticed the peculiar tingling sensation that travels down your spine when you hear someone whispering softly, or when you watch a person carefully folding a blanket with deliberate, methodical movements, or perhaps when you observe the gentle tapping of fingernails against a wooden surface? This phenomenon, which has become increasingly documented and discussed in recent years, is what researchers and enthusiasts refer to as autonomous sensory meridian response, a tingling sensation that typically begins on the scalp and moves down the back of the spine, often accompanied by feelings of deep relaxation and calm. The response appears to be triggered by very specific auditory and visual stimuli, such as soft speaking voices, personal attention scenarios, crisp sounds like page turning or pen clicking, or repetitive hand movements executed with precision and care. What makes this particularly fascinating is that the triggers are remarkably consistent across individuals, despite the fact that what causes the response in one person might leave another person completely unmoved, suggesting that there is something fundamentally wired within our neurological systems that recognizes these particular sensations as inherently soothing and worthy of our attention. The psychological mechanism underlying this response appears to be deeply rooted in our evolutionary need for safety and social bonding, as many of the triggering stimuli replicate scenarios where another person is caring for us, attending to our needs with gentle focus, or performing tasks near us that signal safety and companionship rather than threat. Our brains, shaped over millions of years to detect danger and respond to social cues, may interpret these soft, deliberate, attentive behaviors as signals that we are safe, cared for, and protected, which subsequently triggers a parasympathetic nervous system response that promotes relaxation and sleep. Have you ever noticed that when you feel a sudden chill, experience intense emotion, or listen to particularly moving music, small bumps suddenly appear across your skin, making the tiny hairs on your arms and legs stand straight up? This phenomenon, known as goosebumps or piloerection, is one of those peculiar physiological responses that seems entirely purposeless in our modern world, yet our bodies execute it with remarkable consistency and vigor. The sensation typically begins with a tingling feeling, followed by an involuntary contraction of the erector pili muscles, which are tiny muscles attached to the base of each hair follicle throughout your body, causing them to stand upright and creating that characteristic bumpy texture across your skin. The response can be triggered by multiple different stimuli: cold temperatures, fear, awe, nostalgia, or even the anticipation of something emotionally significant, making it one of the most versatile of our automatic physical responses. What makes this behavior fascinating from a scientific perspective is understanding why our bodies still perform this action when it served such a vital evolutionary purpose for our distant ancestors. In our evolutionary past, when our primate forebears were covered in significantly more body hair than we are today, the ability to make those hairs stand on end served a genuinely protective function, making their bodies appear larger and more threatening to potential predators, a crucial survival mechanism in dangerous environments. Today, however, humans possess relatively sparse body hair, meaning that goosebumps accomplish virtually nothing in terms of physical protection or temperature regulation. yet we continue to experience them with the same intensity and frequency as our ancestors did. You are enjoying a cold beverage or ice cream on a warm day, savoring the refreshing sensation as you consume it quickly, when suddenly a sharp, stabbing pain erupts across your forehead and temples, forcing you to pause mid-enjoyment and wince in discomfort until the sensation fades within seconds. This phenomenon, commonly called brain freeze or ice cream headache, is one of the most universally experienced yet peculiar physical sensations that humans encounter, affecting people across cultures and age groups who have ever eaten something frozen too rapidly. The mechanism behind this strange and temporary pain involves the rapid cooling of blood vessels and nerve endings in the back of your throat and palate, specifically an area called the sphenopalatine ganglion, which is a bundle of nerve fibers responsible for sending sensory information to your brain about temperature and pain in that region. When something intensely cold passes through this sensitive area, the blood vessels constrict suddenly in response to the temperature change, and your nervous system interprets this rapid constriction as a threat, sending pain signals that your brain perceives as a headache located higher up in your skull, even though the actual source of stimulation is in your throat and mouth. This is a classic example of referred pain, where your brain misinterprets the location of discomfort based on neural pathways and past experiences. What makes brain freeze particularly curious is that despite knowing exactly what causes it and being able to predict it almost certainly when eating frozen foods quickly, humans continue to engage in the behavior that triggers it, suggesting that the momentary pleasure of consuming cold treats outweighs the brief discomfort we know will follow, and we have collectively normalized this small suffering as an acceptable trade-off in our pursuit of refreshment and enjoyment, rarely considering it worthy of genuine concern, even though Imagine yourself sitting in the back seat of a car traveling down a winding road, or perhaps you're on a boat moving through choppy waters, or even in an airplane experiencing turbulence at 30,000 feet, and suddenly the world begins to spin around you in a deeply uncomfortable way that makes your stomach churn and your head feel light and disconnected from reality itself. This is motion sickness, one of the most peculiar and seemingly paradoxical experiences the human body can produce, because it occurs not when you are actually moving incorrectly or in danger, but rather when your sensory systems receive conflicting information about whether you are moving at all. The mechanism behind this strange affliction involves what scientists call sensory conflict theory, which describes how your brain receives different signals from multiple sensory systems simultaneously. Your eyes might tell your brain that you are stationary while watching the horizon, but your inner ear, which contains the vestibular system responsible for detecting motion and balance, is signaling that your body is accelerating and turning through space. When you read a book in a moving vehicle, your visual system perceives that you are still relative to the pages, yet your vestibular system detects the acceleration and momentum of the car itself, creating a fundamental disagreement between these two crucial sources of information. Your brain, unable to reconcile these conflicting signals, essentially interprets this mismatch as a warning sign that something is profoundly wrong, possibly that you have been poisoned and are hallucinating, which triggers a protective response that includes nausea, dizziness, and an overwhelming urge to vomit. What makes motion sickness particularly strange is that it serves almost no protective purpose in modern life, yet persists as a vestigial reaction from our evolutionary past, when sensory conflicts of this nature might have indeed indi. Picture yourself sitting in the back seat of a moving vehicle, watching the landscape blur past the windows while your body remains stationary relative to your immediate surroundings, and suddenly a wave of nausea begins to build in your stomach, your head grows light, and an overwhelming sense of dizziness takes hold, forcing you to close your eyes and grip the seat beneath you in hopes that the sensation will pass. This experience, known as motion sickness or car sickness, affects millions of people during car rides, boat trips, and airplane journeys, yet it remains one of the more peculiar responses our bodies can produce to a seemingly ordinary stimulus. The mechanism behind car sickness lies in a fundamental conflict that occurs within your sensory systems, specifically between what your inner ear perceives about motion and balance and what your eyes are reporting to your brain about your position in space. Your vestibular system, located deep within your inner ear, is exquisitely sensitive to acceleration, deceleration, and changes in direction, constantly sending signals about your body's movement through three-dimensional space. However, when you are seated in a vehicle, and looking at objects inside the car that are also moving with you, your visual system reports that you are stationary, creating a profound disconnect between these two sensory inputs. Your brain, faced with conflicting information from these two major sensory systems, interprets this mismatch as a sign of poisoning, since such sensory conflicts can occur after consuming toxins that impair coordination and balance. In response to this perceived threat, your body triggers nausea and vomiting as a protective mechanism, attempting to expel whatever poison it believes you have ingested. The remarkable aspect of carsickness is that this response persists despite our modern understanding of vehicles and our conscious knowledge that we are safe and that no actual toxin is present. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship, the horizon gently rising and falling before your eyes, the deck beneath your feet moving in ways your body has never experienced on solid ground, and suddenly an overwhelming wave of nausea washes over you despite the fact that you are not ill in any traditional sense. You feel dizzy, your stomach churns, your vision blurs slightly, and an almost irresistible urge to vomit overtakes your entire being. This is seasickness, one of the most peculiar and seemingly unnecessary responses your body can produce, affecting millions of people who venture onto water each year. The experience typically begins within minutes of boarding a vessel and can persist for hours or even days, depending on the individual and the severity of the motion. What makes seasickness particularly fascinating is that it serves absolutely no evolutionary purpose, yet your body produces it with remarkable consistency and intensity. The mechanism behind seasickness lies in a fundamental conflict between the systems in your body that perceive motion and maintain balance. Inside your inner ear exists a sophisticated apparatus called the vestibular system, filled with fluid and lined with sensory hair cells that detect movement and acceleration. When you are on a moving ship, this system detects the constant swaying, rolling, and pitching motions with precision. Simultaneously, your eyes are looking out at the horizon or the interior of a cabin, sending visual information to your brain about what appears to be stationary surroundings. Your proprioceptive system, which tells you where your body is in space through signals from your muscles and joints, also reports that you are standing still on a stable surface. This creates a profound sensory mismatch within your brain. Your vestibular system is insisting that you are moving in 3 dimensions, while your visual and proprioceptive systems argue that you are stationary. Imagine stepping into a virtual reality headset or sitting down in front of a racing video game, fully aware that you are stationary in a safe room. Yet within minutes your stomach begins to churn, your head grows dizzy, and a wave of nausea washes over you despite the complete absence of actual motion. This phenomenon, known as simulator sickness, represents one of the most peculiar disconnects between what your body experiences and what your mind knows to be true. You sit perfectly still on a chair, your inner ear detecting no movement whatsoever, your proprioceptive sensors confirming that you remain in a fixed position, and yet your visual system floods your brain with information about rapid acceleration, rotation, and directional change. The conflict arises from what neuroscientists call sensory mismatch or sensory incongruence, where the various systems responsible for detecting motion send contradictory signals to your brain simultaneously. Your eyes tell you that the world is moving around you at tremendous speed, that you are turning sharply or ascending rapidly, but your vestibular system, the delicate balance mechanism housed within your inner ear, insists that you are completely motionless. Your brain, desperate to reconcile these contradictory reports and determine what is actually happening, becomes confused and stressed by the competing information, triggering the same neural responses that would normally occur during actual motion sickness. The body then releases stress hormones and activates the nausea response as if you were genuinely moving, even though intellectually you know you are sitting safely in place. What makes this particularly strange is that humans have inhabited the Earth for hundreds of thousands of years without ever encountering this specific type of sensory conflict, and yet our brains have evolved mechanisms sensitive enough to respond to it as though it were a genuine threat to survival, a testament to H. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet meeting, feeling perfectly alert and engaged, when suddenly someone across the table opens their mouth wide in a substantial yawn, and within moments, an irresistible urge overtakes you to yawn as well, even though you were not tired just seconds before. This phenomenon of contagious yawning represents one of the most peculiar social behaviors that humans exhibit, a reflexive mirroring that seems to bypass our conscious control and spreads through groups like an invisible wave of fatigue. The person yawning may have simply needed to stretch their jaw or regulate their oxygen levels, yet somehow their action triggers the same response in observers who watch them, creating a chain reaction of yawning that can persist through an entire gathering. Scientists have long puzzled over why this particular action spreads so readily through human populations, especially since yawning itself remains somewhat mysterious in its primary function, serving purposes related to arousal regulation and temperature control in the brain rather than purely responding to sleepiness. The mechanism behind contagious yawning appears to involve mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action, creating a neural simulation of their behavior within our own minds. This mirroring system, which also underlies our capacity for empathy and social connection, seems particularly sensitive to yawning for reasons that remain not entirely understood by researchers. The contagious nature of yawning strengthens during moments of fatigue or low stimulation, suggesting that our brains may be more susceptible to this mirroring when our own regulatory systems are already working to maintain alertness. Have you ever noticed that when someone near you yawns, you find yourself yawning moments later, almost as if their drowsiness has infected you through some invisible contagion of the body? This phenomenon, known as empathetic yawning, is one of the most peculiar involuntary responses that humans exhibit, and it occurs across cultures and age groups with remarkable consistency. Picture yourself in a meeting or a quiet library when a colleague beside you opens their mouth wide in that characteristic yawn, and despite feeling perfectly alert just seconds before, your own jaw suddenly feels heavy and loosens in an identical gesture. The yawn spreads through the room like a ripple, moving from person to person in a cascade of synchronized drowsiness that defies logical explanation. Scientists have long puzzled over this behavior because, unlike contagious laughter, which serves clear social bonding functions, the purpose of empathetic yawning remains mysteriously unclear. Research suggests that this response is intrinsically linked to our capacity for empathy and theory of mind, that remarkable ability we possess to understand that other beings have thoughts, feelings, and internal experiences separate from our own. When we witness someone yawning, our brains activate regions associated with emotional processing and social cognition, essentially mirroring the other person's state and creating a neurological synchronization between observer and observed. Brain imaging studies have shown that individuals with higher empathy scores experience stronger empathetic yawning responses, suggesting that our susceptibility to catching yawns correlates directly with our capacity to emotionally attune ourselves to others. Yet despite our deep biological and psychological understanding of this mechanism, empathetic yawning persists as something we rarely think about or question, a normalized part of human interaction that we accept without contemplation, continue. Have you ever noticed that when someone near you yawns, you find yourself yawning moments later, even though you were not tired at all, and there was nothing physically triggering your body's need to yawn, yet the impulse comes regardless? Or perhaps you have watched a person walk across an icy surface with careful, deliberate steps, and felt your own leg muscles tense, as though you were the one navigating that treacherous terrain, your body preparing itself for a fall that will never come to you. These are examples of mirror neurons in action, a remarkable system within the brain that causes us to unconsciously replicate the actions, emotions, and physical states of other people around us. Mirror neurons are specialized brain cells that activate both when we perform an action ourselves and when we observe someone else performing that same action, creating a neurological bridge between ourselves and those we watch. When you observe someone grimacing in pain, your anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex light up just as they would if you were experiencing that pain yourself, allowing you to feel an echo of their suffering without physical injury. This mirroring system extends to emotions as well. When someone smiles genuinely at you, the muscles in your own face begin to mirror that expression automatically, which then sends signals to your emotional centers that generate authentic happiness in you, a feedback loop that connects you to another person's inner world through pure biology. The persistence of this behavior reveals something profound about human nature, for despite living in a world where we have intellectual frameworks to distinguish ourselves from others, where we understand logically that someone else's yawn should have no bearing on our own respiratory needs, we remain bound to these automatic processes that blur the boundary between self and other. Have you ever noticed how a single person's bad mood can seem to spread through an entire room, affecting everyone around them without a single word being spoken? Or conversely, how one person's infectious laughter can lift the spirits of complete strangers who have no idea what the joke actually was? This phenomenon is known as emotional contagion, and it represents one of the most pervasive yet invisible forces that shape our social interactions and collective experiences every single day. When you walk into a space where tension hangs in the air, you might feel your shoulders tense and your jaw clench, even though no one has explicitly told you that something is wrong, and this automatic mirroring of emotional states happens through a combination of biological and psychological mechanisms that operate largely beneath our conscious awareness. The primary driver behind emotional contagion is the existence of mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action. And these neurons extend beyond mere physical actions to include emotional expressions and states of being. When you observe someone displaying sadness through their facial expressions, body language, and vocal tone, your mirror neurons begin to activate patterns similar to those occurring in their brain, and simultaneously, your brain releases neurochemicals that produce a mirrored emotional experience within yourself, creating a kind of neural synchronization between you and the observed person. Beyond the neurobiology, emotional contagion also operates through emotional empathy and our deeply ingrained social nature. Because humans have evolved for hundreds of thousands of years to live in groups where survival depended on remaining attuned to the emotional states and intentions of those around us. And this attunement became so fundamental to our species that it now occurs automatically. And have you ever noticed that when you walk alongside another person, your footsteps naturally begin to match their rhythm without any conscious effort or agreement between you, so that both sets of feet strike the ground in perfect unison, creating a single unified cadence rather than two separate and distinct patterns? This phenomenon, known as gait synchronization, occurs with remarkable frequency in everyday life. Whether you are strolling down a sidewalk with a friend, walking through a crowded shopping mall beside a stranger, or even marching in a group procession where hundreds of people unconsciously align their steps into one synchronized movement. The mechanism behind this behavior appears to be rooted in our tendency toward entrainment, a biological principle where one rhythmic system gradually aligns itself with another rhythmic system through repeated exposure and subtle social cues that we process below the level of conscious awareness. When you walk near someone else, your brain is constantly receiving visual and auditory information about their pace, stride length, and the timing of their footfalls, and this information triggers a natural tendency to mirror their rhythm, similar to how our heartbeats might synchronize or how our breathing patterns become matched during intimate conversation. This synchronization serves several potential functions. It may enhance social bonding by creating a sense of unity and shared experience. It could improve coordination and prevent collisions in crowded spaces, and it might even trigger the release of endorphins that make the shared activity feel more pleasant and connected. What is particularly fascinating is that synchronizing footsteps requires no explicit communication, no visible signal, and no conscious intention, yet it happens reliably across cultures and throughout human history, suggesting it is deeply embedded in our neurobiology rather than learned through culture. Have you ever noticed how quickly your speech patterns shift when you spend time with someone from a different region or country, almost without conscious effort or deliberate choice on your part? Perhaps you find yourself naturally adopting the rolling RS of a Spanish speaker, or the clipped vowels of a British accent, or the melodic cadence of an Irish brogue, simply because you have been immersed in conversation with someone who speaks that way, and before you realize what is happening, those linguistic patterns have begun to influence the way you form your own words and phrases. This phenomenon is so common and so natural that most people experience it at some point in their lives, yet few pause to consider the underlying mechanisms that drive this seemingly automatic behavior. The scientific explanation reveals that humans possess a remarkable neurological capacity called automatic imitation or motor mimicry, which operates through neural pathways in the brain that are designed to help us understand, empathize with, and ultimately connect with other people around us. When we hear someone speak with a particular accent or intonation pattern, specialized neurons called mirror neurons activate in our brain, firing in much the same way as they would if we ourselves were producing those sounds, and this neural resonance creates a powerful drive to replicate what we are hearing. Additionally, there exists a social and psychological dimension to accent mimicry that extends beyond mere neurology, for humans instinctively recognize that sharing speech patterns is a form of bonding and social alignment, a way of signaling that we belong to the same group and that we value connection with the people around us. The behavior serves an evolutionary purpose as well, since the ability to adapt our communication style to match those around us would have enhanced our capacity for social cohesion and group survival in ancestral environments. Have you ever noticed that after spending time with someone, you begin to adopt their mannerisms, their speech patterns, or even the way they hold their body without ever consciously deciding to do so? You might find yourself laughing at the same cadence as your friend, adopting their hand gestures when you speak, or even picking up their regional accent after just a few hours of conversation. This phenomenon is called unconscious mimicry, and it occurs constantly in human social interaction without our awareness or deliberate intention. When you sit across from someone at a coffee shop or in a meeting, your brain is quietly monitoring their facial expressions, their posture, the rhythm of their breathing, and the tempo of their speech. Within moments, almost imperceptibly, your own body begins to mirror these behaviors back to them. Your shoulders relax when theirs do, your head tilts in the same direction, and your lips curve into expressions that echo theirs. The mechanism behind this mirroring behavior appears to be deeply rooted in our neurobiology, particularly in the functioning of mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe another person performing that same action. This neural system seems to create an automatic empathetic connection between ourselves and others, fostering a sense of understanding and social bonding. By mimicking another person's behavior, we unconsciously signal to them that we are paying attention, that we understand them, and that we share common ground. Yet despite the evolutionary advantage this behavior once provided, and despite our modern understanding of why it happens, we continue to perform this unconscious mimicry every single day, often remaining completely unaware of how thoroughly our bodies have adopted the characteristics of those around us, making it one of the most persistent and invisible aspects of human social behavior. Have you ever found yourself in a moment of mild embarrassment? Perhaps you made an awkward comment at a social gathering, or someone complimented you unexpectedly, or you realized you had been caught doing something slightly foolish, and felt the sudden rush of heat spreading across your cheeks and neck, your face turning a distinct shade of red that you cannot control no matter how hard you try to suppress it. This involuntary reddening of the face, known as blushing, is one of the most visible and socially awkward physiological responses your body can produce, yet it serves no practical survival function in the modern world. The mechanism behind blushing begins in your nervous system, specifically when you experience a moment of social self-consciousness or mild threat to your social standing. Your brain interprets these feelings of embarrassment or shame, and in response, it triggers your sympathetic nervous system, which causes the blood vessels in your face and neck to dilate, allowing more blood to flow to the surface of your skin. This increased blood flow reflects light differently, creating that characteristic reddening that becomes immediately visible to everyone around you. What makes blushing particularly fascinating from an evolutionary perspective is that researchers believe it may have originally served as an honest signal to others that you recognize your transgression and feel genuinely remorseful or embarrassed by it, thereby potentially diffusing conflict or reestablishing social bonds. However, in contemporary society, blushing often achieves the opposite effect, drawing attention to your discomfort and amplifying the very embarrassment you are trying to manage. The persistence of blushing despite its apparent disadvantage suggests that it remains deeply embedded in your neurological inheritance, a leftover mechanism from an ancestral environment where displaying genuine shame could have social and survival consequences. Have you ever found yourself laughing uncontrollably during a moment of genuine distress, perhaps while receiving bad news, standing before an authority figure in a tense situation, or witnessing something awkward and uncomfortable unfold before your eyes? This peculiar response, known as nervous laughter, represents one of the most confounding contradictions in human emotional expression, where our body seems to betray our actual feelings by producing sounds and facial expressions typically associated with joy and amusement when we are experiencing anything but those emotions. When a person receives criticism from their boss, they might nervously chuckle. When someone witnesses a friend's embarrassing moment, they might suppress a giggle despite feeling genuinely sympathetic. When confronted with news of a tragedy, an inappropriate laugh might escape before they can control it, leaving them feeling guilt and shame for their apparent callousness. The mechanism behind this behavior operates through our nervous systems, attempt to manage overwhelming emotional states by triggering a release valve, a neurological response that dates back to our evolutionary past when laughter served as a social bonding tool and a way to diffuse tension within groups. When we encounter stress, our body floods with cortisol and adrenaline, creating a state of heightened arousal that our mind struggles to process through normal emotional channels, and laughter becomes an outlet for this excess nervous energy, even though it sends completely contradictory signals to those observing us. The phenomenon also operates through what neuroscientists call emotional incongruence, where our conscious awareness of a serious situation conflicts sharply with an involuntary physiological response generated by deeper brain structures that interpret the situation differently, particularly those involved in threat detection and self-protection mechanisms. Consider the moment when you receive news of a long-awaited promotion, or when you see a loved one after years of separation, or when you accomplish something you've worked toward for decades. In these instances of profound joy and emotional intensity, many people find themselves inexplicably weeping, their eyes streaming with tears despite the overwhelming sense of happiness flooding through them. This paradoxical response seems to contradict the basic logic of emotional expression, yet it occurs across cultures and throughout human history with remarkable consistency. The phenomenon reveals something fundamental about how our nervous systems process extreme emotional experiences, particularly those that carry deep significance and meaning. When the brain encounters an emotionally overwhelming moment, whether positive or negative, it triggers a cascade of neurological responses that can result in tears flowing from our eyes. The limbic system, which governs our emotional experiences, becomes highly activated during these peak moments, and this activation can trigger the lacrimal glands to produce tears as a physical manifestation of the intensity being experienced internally. Rather than tears being exclusively linked to sadness, as our cultural conditioning often suggests, they represent a broader neurological response to emotional extremity itself. The body appears to use tears as a release valve for overwhelming affect, regardless of whether that effect derives from joy, sorrow, relief, or even frustration. Additionally, happiness-induced crying often involves a complex layering of emotions that transcends simple positivity. When we experience profound joy, we simultaneously process relief that something difficult has ended, gratitude for what we've received, and sometimes even a bittersweet recognition of everything we've endured to reach that moment. Consider the moment when someone receives news of extraordinary happiness, perhaps learning they have been accepted to their dream university, or witnessing the birth of a child they have longed for, or reuniting with a loved one after years of separation. And in that instant of profound elation, tears begin to stream down their face, their body racked with what appears to be sobs, yet their expression radiates genuine delight rather than distress. This paradoxical response has puzzled observers for centuries, this strange leaking of the eyes during moments of intense positive emotion, when logically one might expect the body to simply celebrate without the physiological markers we associate with sadness and pain. The mechanism underlying tears of joy appears to involve an emotional intensity that overwhelms the nervous system's capacity to regulate itself through conventional means, and neuroscientists propose that when the brain experiences emotions of such extreme magnitude, whether positive or negative, it triggers the lacrimal glands to produce tears as a form of emotional release, a pressure valve for feelings too large for the body to contain quietly. Additionally, tears of joy may serve an evolutionary purpose rooted in social bonding, as the visible display of emotional vulnerability and authentic feeling strengthens connections between individuals and communicates genuine sincerity in moments of celebration. What remains perhaps most curious about this behavior is how completely normalized and accepted it has become, how we not only understand, but deeply appreciate when someone cries during their wedding vows or while holding a newborn, yet we might view the same physical response with concern if it occurred without the contextual happiness to justify it, demonstrating how profoundly our interpretation of bodily responses depends on the emotional narratives we construct around them. Consider the moment when you are sitting in a waiting room before a difficult conversation, or when you have just made a social mistake and the silence that follows feels unbearable, or when someone shares devastating news and you feel an inappropriate smile creeping across your face despite the gravity of the situation. In these moments, laughter emerges not from genuine amusement, but from a deep internal discomfort, a nervous energy that your body seems compelled to release through the familiar mechanism of laughter. This peculiar behavior manifests as chuckling, giggling, or even full laughter when facing anxiety, embarrassment, or tension, creating a social paradox where the response seems entirely disconnected from the emotional context surrounding it. The mechanism driving this phenomenon roots itself in the nervous system's attempt to regulate overwhelming emotions through what scientists call nervous laughter or anxiety laughter, which activates the same neural pathways and muscular responses as genuine mirth. When your brain perceives a threatening or uncomfortable situation, it floods your system with stress hormones including cortisol and adrenaline, creating a state of heightened tension that demands release. Laughter serves as a pressure valve of sorts, allowing your body to discharge this accumulated nervous energy through a socially recognizable outlet that feels safer than openly displaying fear or distress. Furthermore, laughter triggers the release of endorphins, the brain's natural calming chemicals, which provides genuine psychological relief from the anxiety you are experiencing, thus reinforcing the behavior pattern whenever tension arises. This response persists across cultures and throughout human history, despite the social awkwardness it sometimes creates, suggesting it represents a deeply embedded survival mechanism that predates our modern social conventions. Have you ever noticed that whenever you face a particularly demanding period in your life, your body seems to conspire against you by developing a sudden cold, a persistent headache, or a flare-up of a chronic condition that had been dormant for months? This phenomenon, where psychological stress manifests as genuine physical illness, represents one of the most fascinating intersections between mind and body that modern medicine has documented. When you experience intense stress, your nervous system triggers a cascade of physiological responses that were originally designed to help you survive immediate threats. Your body releases hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which suppress your immune system in favor of directing energy toward muscle response and heightened awareness. However, when stress becomes chronic and unrelenting, this suppression continues indefinitely, leaving your immune defenses weakened and vulnerable to infections and inflammation that your body would normally fight off with ease. Beyond simple immune suppression, stress also affects your sleep patterns, digestive function, and inflammatory responses throughout your body, creating multiple pathways through which psychological distress becomes undeniable physical disease. What makes this behavior particularly strange is that we have known about this mind-body connection for decades, yet we continue to operate within social and professional systems that virtually guarantee chronic stress as a baseline condition. We have normalized the experience of getting sick during stressful periods to such an extent that we have created a cultural expectation that illness during demanding times is simply the price of ambition or responsibility. Despite understanding the mechanisms completely, we rarely restructure our lives proactively to prevent the predictable physical collapse that follows prolonged psychological pressure. Consider the person who develops a sudden headache the moment they receive criticism at work, or the individual whose stomach begins to ache during periods of emotional stress, despite having no underlying medical condition that would explain such discomfort. These are manifestations of psychosomatic symptoms, a phenomenon in which psychological distress creates genuine, measurable physical sensations and ailments within the body. The mind and body exist in a deeply interconnected relationship, and when the mind experiences fear, anxiety, grief, or emotional pain, it communicates this distress through the nervous system by triggering the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These chemical messengers cause real physiological responses. Blood vessels constrict, muscles tense, the stomach produces excess acid, and inflammation may increase throughout the body. What makes psychosomatic symptoms particularly fascinating is that they are not imagined or fake, but rather authentic physical manifestations rooted in psychological experiences. A person may truly experience chest pain, dizziness, trembling, or fatigue as a direct result of anxiety, even though no cardiologist or specialist can identify a disease process. The body becomes a vessel through which the mind expresses what words sometimes cannot. This phenomenon persists because the connection between our thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations remains deeply ingrained in human biology, a survival mechanism that once alerted our ancestors to danger. Yet in modern life, where threats are often psychological rather than physical, this ancient system continues firing, causing discomfort that feels entirely real because it is real, even when no structural injury or illness can be found. Imagine a patient suffering from chronic pain entering a clinic where a doctor presents them with a small white pill describing it with absolute confidence as a powerful new medication that will significantly reduce their symptoms within the hour. The patient takes the pill, settles into a comfortable chair, and within 60 minutes they genuinely feel better. Their pain diminishes, their anxiety eases, and they leave the appointment convinced of the treatment's efficacy. However, unknown to the patient, that pill contained no active pharmaceutical ingredient whatsoever. It was nothing but sugar, starch, and binding agents. Yet the relief they experienced was entirely real, measurable, and reproducible. This phenomenon, known as the placebo effect, represents one of the most profound paradoxes in human neurology and psychology, demonstrating that our expectations and beliefs can literally reshape our physiology without any chemical intervention. The mechanism underlying this strange behavior operates through multiple interconnected pathways within the brain and body. When a person receives treatment they believe will help them, their brain releases endogenous opioids and dopamine, actual neurochemicals that genuinely reduce pain perception and improve mood. The expectation itself triggers these biological responses, creating a real physiological change that can be detected through imaging studies and biochemical markers. Furthermore, the power of suggestion activates the parasympathetic nervous system, reducing heart rate and cortisol levels, which naturally diminishes stress and improves immune function. Despite scientific understanding of these mechanisms, the placebo effect persists as one of medicine's most reliable and fascinating phenomena, acknowledged even in rigorous clinical trials where researchers must account for its influence by comparing treatments against placebo controls, revealing that our minds possess an almost limitless copy. Imagine a person receiving a medication they believe will cause severe side effects, only to experience exactly those symptoms within hours, despite the substance being completely inert and harmless. This is the nocebo effect, the dark mirror of the placebo effect, where negative expectations about a treatment or substance actually trigger the very symptoms the person fears will occur. A patient might be warned that a new medication causes dizziness and nausea, and within minutes of taking it, they report feeling lightheaded and their stomach churns uncomfortably, yet the pill contains nothing but sugar and binding agents. The mechanism behind this strange phenomenon operates through the powerful intersection of psychology, physiology, and expectation, where the brain essentially convinces the body that harm is occurring and generates real, measurable physical responses as a result. When someone expects pain, their brain releases less of the body's natural painkillers called endorphins, making them more sensitive to discomfort. When someone anticipates nausea, their digestive system can actually become dysregulated through the autonomic nervous system, producing genuine queasiness. The brain's predictive nature means it constantly prepares the body for what it believes will happen next, and when those predictions include illness or adverse reactions, the body obligingly manifests those very symptoms as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. What makes the nocebo effect particularly fascinating and unsettling is that it operates with complete neurological authenticity. The symptoms are genuinely real and measurable, yet they stem entirely from expectation rather than pharmacology or pathology. Despite our modern scientific understanding of how the mind influences the body, we continue to encounter nocebo effects in clinical settings, where detailed lists of possible side effects sometimes create more problems than they solve, essentially programming people. When faced with an unexpected threat or moment of intense fear, the human body often responds in a way that seems counterintuitive to survival. It simply stops moving, a phenomenon known as tonic immobility or fear-induced freezing. Picture a person who suddenly encounters a predator, whether real or imagined, and instead of running or fighting, their muscles become rigid, their breath shallow, their entire being locked in place as though they have become part of the environment itself. This response is so powerful that it can override conscious thought and intention, leaving individuals feeling trapped within their own bodies despite having the physical capacity to move. The mechanism behind this behavior traces back to the oldest parts of our brain, specifically the ancient structures that have guided survival for millions of years across countless species. When the amygdala, our brain's fear center, detects a threat, it triggers a cascade of neural signals that activate the dorsal vagal complex, a bundle of nerves that essentially tells the body to shut down and conserve resources. This freezing response is evolutionarily older than fight or flight, suggesting that in many predator encounters throughout our ancestral past, remaining motionless was more effective than fleeing, as many predators hunt by detecting movement. The neurotransmitter norepinephrine floods the system, muscles tense involuntarily, and the body shifts into a state of suspended animation that can last from seconds to minutes. What makes this behavior particularly remarkable is how it persists in modern humans facing threats that bear no resemblance to ancestral dangers, such as confronting an angry person, being in a car accident, or receiving shocking news. The body cannot distinguish between a prehistoric predator and a contemporary source of psychological danger, responding with the same ancient protocols that once kept our ancestors alive. Imagine standing face to face with something that terrifies you completely, perhaps a sudden threat or a deeply disturbing sight, and in that moment your vision begins to tunnel, your hearing becomes muffled, and the world seems to fade away into darkness as your body collapses. This phenomenon, known as vasovagal syncope or fear-induced fainting, represents one of the most counterintuitive responses our bodies can produce when confronted with genuine danger. The paradox is striking because at the precise moment when your survival instincts should be heightening every sense and preparing your muscles for action, your body instead does something that makes you completely vulnerable. When extreme fear floods your nervous system, your body initially responds by activating the sympathetic nervous system, the same fight-or-flight response that would normally help you escape danger by elevating heart rate and blood pressure. However, in certain individuals and certain circumstances, a sudden switch occurs where the parasympathetic nervous system takes over, causing your heart rate to drop dramatically and your blood vessels to dilate, which results in a sudden, severe drop in blood pressure. This physiological reversal happens so quickly that your brain cannot receive adequate oxygen, leading to a loss of consciousness that is essentially your body shutting down. The evolutionary explanation for this bizarre mechanism remains somewhat mysterious, though some researchers suggest it may have served as a playing dead response in our ancestral past, where appearing unconscious or dead might have caused a predator to lose interest. The body essentially gives up rather than continuing to struggle, which in prehistoric encounters with certain types of threats might have improved survival odds by making the prey seem no longer worth attacking. Consider the moment when you encounter something unexpected and threatening, perhaps a sudden loud noise in the darkness or the realization that you are in genuine danger, and notice how your body responds with what feels like an involuntary surge of energy and intensity that seems to take control of your conscious mind and decision-making process. This is the fight or flight response, one of the most fundamental and deeply embedded behavioral patterns within the human nervous system, a reaction that has persisted essentially unchanged for millions of years across countless species facing survival challenges. When your brain perceives a threat, whether that threat is real or imagined, your sympathetic nervous system activates almost instantaneously, flooding your bloodstream with stress hormones including adrenaline and cortisol, causing your heart rate to accelerate dramatically, your muscles to tense and prepare for explosive action, your blood vessels to constrict, and your pupils to dilate to gather more visual information about your environment. This cascade of physiological changes happens so rapidly that your conscious mind often has no time to evaluate the threat rationally or consider alternative responses, as your ancient survival instincts prioritize speed over accuracy in this critical moment. The mechanism behind this response is elegantly simple from an evolutionary perspective, because in ancestral environments where humans faced predators and immediate physical dangers, the ability to respond with overwhelming force or sudden escape meant the difference between survival and death, and those individuals whose nervous systems could mobilize faster and more completely were far more likely to pass their genes forward to subsequent generations. When a person encounters a sudden threat or unexpected danger, their body sometimes does something that seems counterintuitive to survival itself. Rather than running away or fighting back, they become completely motionless, their muscles tightening as if they have turned to stone, their breath becoming shallow and their voice disappearing entirely. This is the freeze response, one of the most primitive and paradoxical reactions embedded in the human nervous system. Imagine a deer caught in headlights or a person who has just witnessed a car accident standing perfectly still, unable to move or speak even when their conscious mind screams at them to react. The experience feels involuntary and often bewildering, as if the body has betrayed the mind's desire to act. During these moments, a person might find themselves unable to scream for help, unable to run, unable to do anything except wait in a state of suspended animation while their heart races and their mind floods with adrenaline. The freeze response originates from the ancient survival mechanisms that humans inherited from our evolutionary ancestors, mechanisms that proved effective in a world where predators could be fooled by stillness. When the sympathetic nervous system detects a threat so overwhelming that fighting or fleeing seems impossible or futile, the brain shifts into what neuroscientists call tonic immobility, a state where the body essentially shuts down voluntary movement as a last resort strategy. This response activates the dorsal vagal complex, a neural pathway that essentially tells the body to go limp and stop struggling, a mechanism that may have helped our ancestors survive encounters with larger predators by appearing dead or non-threatening. The freeze also conserves energy and reduces the visibility that movement would create, potentially allowing a person to escape notice or attack. When faced with conflict, threat, or perceived danger, some individuals adopt what psychologists call the Fawn Response, a behavioral pattern in which a person prioritizes appeasing others, seeking to minimize conflict through compliance, agreement, and people-pleasing tendencies, even at the expense of their own needs and boundaries. Imagine a scenario where someone is confronted with criticism from an authority figure or finds themselves in a tense interpersonal situation. Rather than defending themselves, asserting their perspective, or simply removing themselves from the discomfort, they instead become hypervigilant to the emotional states of others, reading facial expressions and tone of voice with exceptional sensitivity, and then systematically adjusting their own behavior, speech, and even posture to accommodate what they perceive the other person wants or needs. This pattern often manifests as excessive apologizing, over-explaining, or taking responsibility for problems that are not actually their fault, and the fawner may find themselves agreeing with statements they disagree with, suppressing their authentic emotions, or volunteering for additional tasks and responsibilities they do not actually have the capacity to handle. The mechanism underlying the fawn response likely originates in early developmental environments where safety and stability were contingent upon meeting the needs of a caregiver or authority figure, creating a learned association between appeasement and survival that becomes deeply embedded in the nervous system. When the brain perceives threat or conflict, it activates this protective response automatically, as the individual has internalized the belief that their only viable option for maintaining safety is to be agreeable, invisible, or useful to others. Have you ever found yourself absent-mindedly picking at a small imperfection on your skin, a scab or a callus, only to realize minutes or hours later that you've created a wound where none seriously existed before? This behavior, known as skin picking or dermatillomania when it becomes compulsive, is a remarkably common human experience that affects people across all ages and walks of life, from children anxiously fidgeting with mosquito bites to adults methodically working at their cuticles during stressful moments. The act typically begins with a genuine imperfection, whether real or imagined, and the picker convinces themselves that removing this imperfection will restore the skin to a state of perfect smoothness and health. Yet the very act of picking often accomplishes the opposite, creating irritation, infection, and scarring that demands further attention. The psychological mechanism underlying skin picking operates on several interconnected levels, beginning with the reward system in the brain that releases small amounts of dopamine and endorphins when the picker finally removes the offending piece of skin or debris, creating a genuine sense of satisfaction and relief that reinforces the behavior. Additionally, skin picking often serves as a self-soothing mechanism during moments of anxiety, boredom, or emotional discomfort, functioning much like other repetitive behaviors such as hair twirling or nail biting, where the physical sensation provides a grounding effect that temporarily alleviates psychological distress. The behavior persists despite its obvious counterproductive nature because the immediate gratification of the act overrides the logical understanding that continued picking will only cause greater problems in the long term, and because our brains are wired to seek immediate relief from discomfort rather than consider future consequences. Have you ever found yourself absently pulling at your hair while concentrating on something else, or perhaps during moments of stress when your mind feels overwhelmed and scattered in multiple directions at once? This seemingly strange habit, which ranges from mild and occasional to severe and compulsive, represents one of the most common yet puzzling behaviors humans engage in without fully understanding why. Some people pull out individual strands while reading or watching television, experiencing a strange satisfaction in the gentle resistance of the follicle before the hair releases, while others develop a condition called trichotillomania, where hair pulling becomes a serious compulsive behavior that results in noticeable bald patches and significant distress. The psychological mechanism behind hair pulling appears to be deeply rooted in the brain's need to regulate emotional states and redirect anxious energy into a physical, tangible action that provides immediate sensory feedback. When we experience stress, anxiety, boredom, or even intense focus, our nervous system seeks an outlet, and hair pulling serves as a self-soothing mechanism that paradoxically combines mild discomfort with a sense of control and release. The repetitive motion, combined with the tactile sensation and the slight pain that registers as almost pleasant, creates a feedback loop in the brain that reinforces the behavior as a coping strategy. What makes this behavior particularly fascinating is that despite our evolved understanding of stress management and psychological health, many people continue to pull their hair without consciously deciding to do so, suggesting that this behavior taps into something far more primal than our rational mind can easily address. The habit persists because it works on a neurochemical level, releasing small amounts of endorphins and providing temporary relief from internal tension, making it remarkably difficult to stop even when we recog. Nail biting, medically known as onychophagia, is one of the most common body-focused repetitive behaviors, affecting somewhere between 20 and 30% of the population at various points in their lives, and many people find themselves unconsciously bringing their fingers to their mouths during moments of stress, boredom, or deep concentration, slowly wearing away at the keratin structures at the tips of their digits without any real awareness of what they're doing. The behavior typically begins in childhood, often around the age of 4 or 5, and it frequently persists into adulthood, becoming such an ingrained habit that individuals barely notice when they're engaged in it, even as their nails diminish to painful nubs and their cuticles become raw and sometimes infected. From a psychological perspective, nail biting serves as a self-soothing mechanism that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the same calming response that occurs when we rock a baby or stroke a pet, and the repetitive sensation provides a form of sensory regulation that can help individuals manage overwhelming emotions or redirect restless energy during periods of anxiety or tedium. The behavior also satisfies a perfectionist impulse, as people who bite their nails often describe an almost aesthetic compulsion to eliminate irregularities, hangnails, or rough edges, creating a cycle where the act itself creates new imperfections that demand attention, perpetuating the habit in an endless loop. Despite the obvious negative consequences, including damaged nails that can take months to regrow, increased susceptibility to infection, and potential damage to the nail bed itself, nail biting persists because the immediate sensory relief and psychological comfort it provides far outweighs the delayed or abstract understanding of harm, and society has largely normalized it as a minor habit rather than treating it with the same concern we might direct toward other self. Have you ever noticed someone rhythmically bending their fingers backward until a sharp popping sound erupts from their knuckles? Or perhaps you yourself have engaged in this peculiar habit countless times throughout your day without giving it much thought. The act of knuckle cracking represents one of humanity's most widespread and persistent self-directed behaviors, occurring in offices, classrooms, and homes across the world, yet it remains shrouded in misconception and parental concern. When a person deliberately flexes or extends their finger joints with sudden force, creating that distinctive cracking sound, they are initiating a fascinating biomechanical process within the synovial fluid that lubricates their joints. Inside each of your knuckles exists a small space filled with synovial fluid, and this fluid contains dissolved gases including nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. When you rapidly change the pressure within the joint capsule by bending your finger backward, you create a sudden drop in pressure that causes these dissolved gases to rapidly come out of solution, forming tiny bubbles in a process called cavitation. The immediate collapse and formation of these gas bubbles produces that audible popping or cracking sound that so many people find either satisfying or deeply irritating, depending on their perspective. The sensation that often accompanies knuckle cracking, a feeling of relief or increased mobility in the joint, reinforces the behavior through positive feedback, encouraging people to repeat it again and again throughout their waking hours. Interestingly, despite decades of medical research and countless parental warnings that knuckle cracking causes arthritis or joint damage, scientific evidence has failed to demonstrate any genuine long-term harm from the practice. Yet millions of people continue to feel compelled to perform it regularly, driven primarily by the immediate gratification and temporary sense of comfort. Have you ever found yourself sitting in a waiting room at a desk during work, or perhaps during a tense conversation, when suddenly you notice your leg bouncing up and down in a rhythmic, almost automatic fashion? This peculiar behavior, sometimes called restless leg syndrome in its milder forms or simply fidgeting in everyday contexts, is one of the most common yet rarely questioned physical habits that humans engage in throughout their lives. The leg bounces steadily, sometimes slowly and sometimes with considerable vigor, often without the person being consciously aware that they are even doing it until someone else points it out or until they catch themselves in the act. The behavior typically intensifies during moments of stress, anxiety, boredom, or when we are required to sit still for extended periods while our minds remain active and engaged with complex thoughts or emotional stimuli. What makes this behavior particularly fascinating is that it serves no obvious functional purpose, yet it persists as one of our most ingrained and automatic physical responses. The scientific explanation for leg bouncing reveals itself to be far more complex and interesting than simple nervous energy. When our bodies experience stress or anxiety, our nervous system activates the fight or flight response, preparing us for action and movement. However, in modern life, we are often constrained by social circumstances to remain seated and still while our internal physiology is primed for action. The leg bouncing appears to be a compromise mechanism, a way for our body to discharge the accumulated tension and excess energy without actually standing up or leaving the situation. This rhythmic movement serves as a self-soothing mechanism, similar to how rocking motions calm infants and how repetitive movements can reduce anxiety in people with various conditions. Have you ever found yourself bouncing your leg during a meeting, tapping your fingers on a desk while waiting for an appointment, or twirling a pen between your hands while concentrating on a difficult problem? This seemingly restless and purposeless movement is fidgeting, a behavior so common that most of us engage in it without even noticing, yet so universal that it appears across nearly every culture and age group on Earth. The fidgeter sits in a chair, perhaps in an uncomfortable waiting room or during a tedious lecture, and their body refuses to remain still despite their conscious mind attempting to focus on something entirely unrelated to movement. Their fingers drum rhythmically against the armrest, their foot taps against the floor in a repetitive pattern, or their hands find some small object to manipulate, twist, and turn repeatedly. From the outside, it appears as though the person is nervous, bored, or unable to control their impulses. Yet the science behind fidgeting reveals a far more sophisticated and purposeful neurological mechanism than mere restlessness might suggest. Research in neuroscience has demonstrated that fidgeting actually serves multiple important functions for the human brain and body, functioning as a form of self-regulation that helps maintain optimal levels of stimulation and alertness. When our nervous system detects that we are not receiving enough sensory input or that our attention is beginning to wane, the brain initiates small, automatic movements that generate just enough stimulation to keep our cognitive systems engaged and functioning at peak capacity. This is particularly true in situations where external stimulation is low, such as during boring tasks or monotonous environments, where the body compensates by creating internal stimulation through movement. Have you ever noticed yourself walking back and forth across a room while trying to solve a difficult problem, or found yourself unable to sit still while wrestling with a complex decision? This behavior, known as pacing while thinking, is so common that most people perform it without conscious awareness, yet it remains one of those curious human habits that seems almost involuntary when our minds are engaged in serious cognitive work. Whether you're a student preparing for an exam, a professional working through a challenging project, or someone simply trying to remember an important detail, the impulse to move your body while your mind labors seems nearly universal, suggesting that something fundamental connects physical motion to mental processing. The mechanism behind this behavior appears to involve the way our brains coordinate movement and cognition through interconnected neural pathways that have been refined over our evolutionary history. When we face a difficult thinking task, our brains naturally seek to increase arousal and optimize cognitive performance, and movement serves as an effective tool for achieving this enhancement without requiring conscious direction. The motor cortex and prefrontal cortex, which handle planning and executive function, maintain strong neural connections that allow physical activity to stimulate the same regions responsible for working memory and problem-solving. Additionally, pacing generates rhythmic movement that can enhance blood flow to the brain, increase oxygen delivery, and trigger the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine that improve focus and motivation. The repetitive nature of walking back and forth may also provide a form of self-regulation, creating a predictable sensory input that allows the mind to concentrate more effectively on abstract problems without distraction. You find yourself alone in your home or walking down a quiet street, and suddenly you hear your own voice filling the silence, narrating your thoughts, rehearsing a conversation you plan to have, or simply commenting on the task at hand, and you might pause for a moment wondering if anyone heard you or thinking that perhaps this habit is unusual. Talking to yourself is something that happens across nearly all human cultures and age groups, from children working through problems aloud to elderly individuals maintaining running conversations with themselves throughout their day. And yet it remains somewhat socially stigmatized despite being remarkably common and deeply rooted in human cognition. When you engage in self-directed speech, your brain is actually activating multiple neural pathways simultaneously, strengthening memory formation and enhancing cognitive processing in ways that silent thought simply cannot achieve, which is why students often read aloud when studying and why people rehearse difficult conversations before they happen. The act of externalizing your internal thoughts through vocalization creates a feedback loop where your brain receives auditory information about what you have just said, allowing you to process information more thoroughly and catch errors or inconsistencies that might otherwise escape your notice. This phenomenon becomes especially pronounced during moments of cognitive load or stress, when your prefrontal cortex demands additional resources to manage complex tasks, and self-directed speech essentially serves as an external cognitive tool that reduces the mental burden you are carrying. Furthermore, talking to yourself can provide emotional regulation and psychological comfort, as the sound of your own voice becomes a familiar anchor in moments of uncertainty or loneliness, creating a sense of companionship with the one person who always understands your perspective completely. Have you ever noticed yourself speaking words aloud when you are alone, narrating your actions as if someone else were listening, or working through a problem by saying things out loud that you could easily think privately to yourself? Perhaps you have caught yourself talking through a grocery list while shopping, muttering calculations under your breath while doing math, or speaking aloud the steps of a recipe as you cook, even though your eyes can see everything you need to do written right there in front of you. This phenomenon, known as thinking out loud or externalizing thought, is remarkably common among humans across cultures and age groups, yet it seems entirely unnecessary from a purely logical standpoint. When we think out loud, we are converting our internal mental processes into audible speech, which requires additional cognitive effort, coordination of our vocal apparatus, and the expenditure of physical energy that silent thinking would not demand. The scientific explanation for this behavior reveals that speaking our thoughts actually enhances our cognitive processing in measurable ways. When we verbalize our thoughts, we activate additional neural pathways beyond those used in silent cognition, engaging the language centers of our brain more fully and creating multiple sensory inputs that reinforce our understanding and memory formation. The act of hearing our own words creates an auditory feedback loop that provides our brain with confirmation of what we are thinking, making abstract concepts feel more concrete and real. This external processing helps us catch errors we might have missed in silent thought, allows us to organize complex information more systematically, and actually improves our problem-solving abilities, which is why students who speak through difficult concepts often perform better than those who remain silent. You sit in a meeting staring at the speaker, yet your mind is somewhere else entirely, perhaps on a beach you visited years ago, or in a conversation you wish you had, or accomplishing something you've always dreamed of doing. Your eyes remain open and focused, your body present in the room, but your conscious attention has drifted away into an internal landscape of imagination and memory. This is daydreaming, one of the most universal human experiences, yet it remains one of the most mysterious aspects of how our minds function. Neuroscientists have discovered that daydreaming activates what they call the default mode network, a system of brain regions that becomes active when we are not focused on external tasks. This network includes areas involved in memory, social thinking, and self-referential processing, essentially the parts of the brain that construct our sense of self and our understanding of others. When we daydream, we are essentially allowing our brain to consolidate memories, process emotions, and simulate future scenarios without the constraints of immediate environmental demands. Rather than being a sign of laziness or distraction, daydreaming appears to be a fundamental cognitive function that helps us plan for the future, work through emotional challenges, and maintain our sense of identity. The brain seems to require these moments of internal focus to function optimally, and yet in our modern world of constant stimulation and productivity demands, we often feel guilty for allowing our minds to wander. We are taught that attention should be directed outward, that daydreaming is a waste of time, that we should always be productive and present. Yet studies suggest that people who daydream more frequently often perform better at creative tasks and are more innovative in their problem-solving approaches. Have you ever found yourself sitting in a meeting, a classroom, or during a conversation with someone, fully aware that you are present in the room, yet simultaneously absent from the moment unfolding before you, your mind having drifted to somewhere entirely different, perhaps replaying a conversation from days ago or imagining a scenario that has no bearing on your current reality? And then suddenly snapping back to awareness, only to realize that minutes have passed without you retaining a single word of what was said around you. This peculiar state of consciousness is what we call zoning out, and it happens to nearly everyone with startling regularity. When we zone out, our brain enters what neuroscientists refer to as a state of mind-wandering or stimulus-independent thought, a condition where our attention decouples from the external environment and redirects inward toward our own mental representations, memories, and imaginings. The mechanism behind this involves a specific neural network called the default mode network, which becomes active when our prefrontal cortex, responsible for directed attention, diminishes its grip on our cognitive resources, allowing our mind to operate on autopilot. During these episodes, your brain is not actually resting. Instead, it is engaging in spontaneous thought, memory consolidation, and creative processing, functions that are genuinely important for psychological health and problem-solving. What makes zoning out particularly strange is that despite our conscious awareness of its occurrence and our general recognition that it represents a failure to focus, we have essentially normalized it as an unavoidable aspect of human existence, rarely seeking to eliminate it entirely even though modern society demands our sustained attention more than ever before, suggesting that perhaps zoning out serves some deeper purpose that our minds require. Even when logic tells us we should simply stay present and engaged. You have experienced the peculiar sensation of becoming mentally absent while physically present, a state commonly referred to as spacing out or zoning out, where your consciousness seems to drift away from the immediate environment and your thoughts scatter into an unfocused haze. Perhaps you were sitting in a meeting, listening to someone speak, yet your mind wandered to an entirely different location, replaying a conversation from days ago or imagining a future scenario that has no bearing on the present moment. Your eyes remained open, fixed in the general direction of the speaker, yet nothing they said registered in your awareness, and only when they called your name did you suddenly snap back to reality, disoriented and embarrassed. This phenomenon occurs because your brain possesses a limited capacity for sustained attention, and when the external stimuli fail to demand active engagement, your mind naturally defaults to a state known as the default mode network, a collection of interconnected brain regions that activate when you are not focused on the external world. During spacing out, your prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and directed attention, reduces its activity, while regions associated with self-referential thinking and memory consolidation become more prominent, causing your thoughts to turn inward toward your own mental landscape. The brain essentially switches from an external to an internal focus, allowing your attention to follow whatever thought patterns emerge most readily from your memory and imagination. This is actually a deeply adaptive mechanism that serves several important functions, including memory processing, creative problem-solving, and emotional regulation. Yet we have learned to view spacing out as a social transgression and a sign of rudeness or lack of intelligence, despite the fact that it is an entirely normal neurological process that happens to virtually everyone throughout their daily L. Have you ever found yourself sitting in a meeting, reading a book, or listening to someone speak, only to suddenly realize that the last 10 minutes have completely escaped your conscious attention, and your thoughts have drifted to something entirely unrelated, perhaps to dinner plans or a conversation from yesterday or an imagined future scenario that may never occur? This experience, known as mind-wandering or task-unrelated thought, represents one of the most peculiar and universal aspects of human consciousness, a state in which our attention detaches from the present moment and becomes absorbed in internal mental narratives that have no connection to our immediate environment or responsibilities. The phenomenon is so common that researchers estimate the average person's mind wanders between 30 and 50% of their waking hours, suggesting that we spend nearly half our lives mentally absent from the very experiences we are supposedly engaging in. The mechanism behind mind wandering appears to involve a shift in neural activity from the task-positive networks, which handle focused attention and external awareness, to the default mode network, a system of interconnected brain regions that activates when we are not concentrating on specific external tasks and instead engage in self-referential thinking, imagination, and memory consolidation. This network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus, regions that light up with activity when we daydream, reminisce, or contemplate hypothetical futures. Unlike a failure of attention or a symptom of disorder, mind wandering appears to serve several adaptive functions, including the processing of emotional experiences, the solving of creative problems through unconscious incubation, the planning of future scenarios, and the integration of information from recent experiences into our broader understanding of ourselves and the world. Have you ever noticed how your mind seems to wander away from the task at hand, even when you are genuinely trying to focus on something important, like reading a book, listening to a lecture, or working on a project that requires your full concentration? You might find yourself staring at a page for several minutes only to realize that you have absolutely no memory of the words you just read, or you might be sitting in a meeting and suddenly become aware that your thoughts have drifted to what you might have for dinner or what you need to accomplish later in the week. This phenomenon is called attention drift, and it happens to nearly everyone on a regular basis, sometimes multiple times throughout a single day. The curious thing about attention drift is that it does not necessarily mean you are lazy or incapable of focus, nor does it indicate a lack of intelligence or motivation. Instead, it represents a fundamental aspect of how the human brain is actually designed to operate. Your brain is essentially a prediction machine that is constantly trying to conserve energy and resources whenever possible, and when a task becomes routine or when your brain perceives that the current activity does not pose an immediate threat or require urgent response, it naturally begins to allocate your attention elsewhere. The neural networks involved in maintaining focus require considerable metabolic energy, and your brain will automatically reduce this expenditure if it senses an opportunity to do so. Furthermore, the human mind seems to have an innate preference for novelty and stimulation, which means that repetitive or familiar tasks become increasingly difficult to sustain attention upon over time. What makes attention drift particularly interesting is that we have come to accept it as simply an inevitable feature of human consciousness, something we casually reference and sometimes even joke about, despite the fact that it creates genuine challenges in O. Imagine you are watching a film, and an actor walks across a room wearing a red jacket, yet in the very next scene, that same actor is somehow wearing a blue jacket instead, and nobody in the audience seems to notice or care about this sudden transformation. This phenomenon is called change blindness, and it represents one of the most fascinating paradoxes of human perception, revealing that our eyes and brains are far less reliable witnesses to the world than we assume them to be. The mechanism behind change blindness stems from the way our visual attention actually functions, because contrary to popular belief, we do not see the entire world before us in perfect clarity and detail at all times. Instead, our brains are incredibly selective about what they process, focusing attention on only a small portion of our visual field while filling in the rest with assumptions and memory. When a change occurs in an area of our visual landscape where our attention is not currently directed, the brain simply does not register it, and because we feel confident in our visual awareness, we remain convinced that we would have noticed any significant alteration. Scientists have conducted countless experiments demonstrating this effect, asking observers to watch videos and identify changes between scenes, only to find that people miss absurdly obvious modifications, including someone changing clothes entirely, a person vanishing from the scene, or objects appearing and disappearing right in front of their eyes. The reason this occurs is that the brain operates under a principle of efficiency, allocating limited cognitive resources to what seems important in the moment rather than attempting to catalog every minute detail of our surroundings. This deeply ingrained tendency has persisted throughout human evolution because in most survival situations, focusing intently on relevant threats and opportunities mattered far more than noticing every incidental detail. Imagine you are watching a video of people passing basketballs between each other, and you are given the specific task of counting how many times the ball is passed among members of one particular team. You focus intently on this single objective, your eyes tracking the movement of the ball back and forth across the screen as the players move around. Your attention is completely absorbed by this counting task, and you perform it with confidence, reporting the final number when the video ends. However, what you did not notice, what your eyes quite literally looked at but your brain refused to register, was a person in a gorilla costume who walked directly through the middle of the scene, beat their chest, and then walked away. This is inattentional blindness, one of the most profound demonstrations that we do not see the world as it actually is, but rather we see only what our brains have decided is important enough to attend to. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is fundamentally about selective attention and the limited capacity of conscious awareness. Your brain receives an overwhelming amount of sensory information at every moment, far more than your conscious mind could possibly process, and so it has evolved a sophisticated filtering system that prioritizes certain information while completely suppressing other information from awareness. When you commit your attentional resources to one task, such as counting basketball passes, your visual system continues to process the entire scene, but the information about irrelevant stimuli is filtered out before it reaches your conscious perception. The gorilla is seen by your eyes and processed by your brain, but because it has been deemed irrelevant to your current task, it is essentially rendered invisible to your awareness. Imagine yourself in a crowded coffee shop on a busy afternoon, surrounded by dozens of conversations happening simultaneously. The hiss of the espresso machine, the clinking of ceramic cups, the ambient music playing softly in the background, and yet somehow you are able to focus entirely on the single conversation you are having with the friend sitting across from you, filtering out nearly everything else as if those other sounds exist in a distant, muffled world that barely registers in your conscious awareness. This phenomenon is known as selective attention, and it represents one of the most remarkable and yet seemingly invisible capabilities of the human mind. Your brain receives an enormous amount of sensory information from your environment at every single moment, far more than your conscious awareness could possibly process. So instead of attempting to process everything equally, your brain acts like a sophisticated filter, allowing you to prioritize certain information while relegating other stimuli to the background. This filtering mechanism is driven by what you are already focused on, what you find emotionally significant, and what your brain has learned to consider important based on past experience and immediate goals. When you attend to your friend's words, your brain actively suppresses the neural processing of irrelevant background noise, essentially turning down the volume on information your mind deems unnecessary for your current task. The mechanism behind this selective filtering involves attention networks in the brain, particularly in areas like the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex, which work together to enhance processing of relevant information while simultaneously inhibiting irrelevant stimuli through a process of neural competition. Imagine a person who believes that a particular political party is corrupt, and they spend their evenings scrolling through news articles and social media posts, carefully selecting only those stories that reinforce their existing conviction while unconsciously scrolling past contradictory evidence. And by the end of the night, they feel even more certain of their belief than they were before, yet they have fundamentally only exposed themselves to information that already aligned with what they wanted to think. This is confirmation bias, one of the most pervasive and quietly influential patterns in human cognition, a tendency so deeply woven into how we process information that most people remain entirely unaware they are engaging in it at all. The mechanism behind this behavior operates through several interconnected psychological pathways that begin the moment we encounter new information. Our brains are essentially prediction machines, constantly working to confirm the models of the world we have already constructed, and when we encounter a piece of information that matches our existing beliefs, our brain releases a small amount of dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with reward and satisfaction, which makes confirming information feel good and therefore more memorable. Conversely, when we encounter information that contradicts our worldview, our brain initiates what researchers call cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable mental state that our minds are strongly motivated to resolve. And the easiest way to resolve this discomfort is to dismiss, reinterpret, or simply ignore the contradictory information. We unconsciously seek out people, media, and sources that share our perspective, a phenomenon known as selective exposure, and we ask questions in ways designed to elicit answers that support our position, and we remember facts that align with our beliefs far more readily than facts that challenge them. Imagine you've just learned about a particular word, concept, or brand name that was previously invisible to your awareness, and suddenly you begin to see it everywhere. Perhaps you heard about a specific car model for the first time, and now that exact vehicle appears on nearly every street you drive down. Or you discover a new song, and within days you swear the radio station is playing it constantly. This phenomenon is what psychologists call frequency illusion, also known as the Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon or frequency bias, and it represents one of the most pervasive yet completely benign tricks your mind plays on you throughout your daily life. The experience feels undeniably real because you are genuinely noticing these instances more often, yet the actual frequency of occurrence has remained entirely unchanged from before your awareness shifted. What has transformed is not the world around you, but rather your selective attention and the way your brain processes incoming sensory information. The mechanism underlying frequency illusion operates through a combination of cognitive processes that work together seamlessly to create this convincing illusion. When you first learn about something new, that information becomes active in your working memory and remains readily accessible in your consciousness. Your brain then begins to operate with something called a heightened detection threshold, meaning that whenever similar stimuli appear in your environment, you notice them with significantly greater ease than you would have before. This is not a conscious choice, but rather an automatic filtering system that your attention system employs. Additionally, once something enters your awareness, your brain creates what neuroscientists call a perceptual set, essentially a mental lens through which you now view your surroundings. Have you ever learned a new word and suddenly you see it everywhere? You discover the term petrichor describing the smell of rain on dry earth, and within days you encounter it in a novel, overhear it in conversation, and spot it in an article you were already reading. The coincidences feel too frequent to be random, yet the word was always present in the world around you before you knew its name. This experience is called the Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon, named after a German terrorist group that a man kept encountering references to shortly after first learning about them. The pattern felt so persistent that he eventually wrote to a newspaper about these supposed coincidences, inadvertently naming the effect after the very organization that had sparked his observations. The phenomenon itself, however, is not a matter of increased frequency in the external world, but rather a transformation in your internal attentional filters. Once your brain registers something as relevant or interesting, it automatically becomes more sensitive to detecting that same pattern in future encounters, a process known as frequency illusion or selective attention. Your brain is constantly filtering millions of sensory inputs, and it prioritizes information based on what you have recently deemed important or novel. When you learn about a concept or word, your reticular activating system, the network of neurons responsible for filtering attention, suddenly flags that information as significant and worth monitoring. Consequently, you begin noticing instances of that word or concept that were always present, but had previously been filtered out by your unconscious mind as irrelevant background noise. This is not a failure of perception, but rather an efficient adaptation, allowing your brain to focus cognitive resources on information that matches your current interests and concerns. Consider a basketball player who makes 3 successful shots in a row and suddenly develops what commentators call hot hand, where spectators and even coaches become convinced that this player has entered a state of heightened performance and is more likely to make the next shot, when in fact the probability remains statistically identical to any other moment in the game. Yet the clustering of recent successes creates an overwhelming sense of pattern and inevitability in our minds. This phenomenon extends far beyond sports into the everyday experiences of our lives, where we notice coincidences that feel remarkable and improbable, such as thinking of a friend moments before they call us, or hearing a particular song on the radio twice in one day, or experiencing a series of small misfortunes that convince us we are having an unlucky day, when these clusters are actually the natural and expected outcome of random distribution across time. The psychological mechanism driving clustering illusion emerges from our brain's fundamental need to detect patterns and impose order upon the chaos of experience. As pattern recognition has been essential to human survival throughout our evolutionary history, allowing our ancestors to identify predators, locate resources, and navigate their environments with greater efficiency and success. However, this same cognitive gift becomes a liability in modern life when we encounter the sheer volume and complexity of random events. Because our pattern detection systems evolved in environments with far fewer data points and less exposure to probability, leaving us deeply susceptible to mistaking random clusters for meaningful signals and genuine patterns that demand explanation. We see this illusion persist in superstitions, in stock market predictions, in medical misdiagnoses, and in countless personal beliefs about luck, fate, and causation, even among highly educated and scientifically literate people who nt. Imagine you are lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and suddenly you notice that the water stains on the plaster seem to form the shape of a face looking down at you. Or perhaps you find yourself seeing patterns in the random arrangement of ceiling tiles that appear to spell out a word or convey a message meant just for you. This experience of perceiving meaningful patterns, connections, or messages in completely random or unrelated data is called apophenia, and it is one of the most pervasive yet invisible cognitive phenomena that shapes how we interpret the world around us every single day. The human brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine, an organ that evolved over millions of years to quickly identify threats, opportunities, and meaningful relationships in complex environments. And this survival-oriented wiring makes us extraordinarily good at spotting genuine patterns, yet it also makes us prone to seeing patterns that do not actually exist. When you encounter random noise, whether it is the static on an old television screen, the random arrangement of clouds in the sky, or even the completely arbitrary sequence of numbers generated by chance, your brain immediately begins searching for structure and meaning, comparing these random inputs against the vast library of patterns it has learned throughout your lifetime. This happens automatically and almost instantaneously, before your conscious mind even has a chance to evaluate whether the pattern is real or imaginary, and this automatic processing system is so powerful that even when you intellectually know something is random, your brain continues to extract apparent patterns from it regardless. The mechanism behind apophenia relates directly to how our brains balance two competing processes. One system that is highly sensitive and quick to detect patterns, ensuring we never miss a real threat or opportunity, and another system that is slower but more careful, designed to. Imagine a woman who has just been promoted to a senior management position after years of excellent performance reviews, successful projects, and consistent recognition from her peers and supervisors. Yet she finds herself convinced that she does not deserve this role and that her colleagues will soon discover she is a fraud who has somehow deceived everyone into believing she is competent. This experience, repeated across countless professions and achievement levels, is what psychologists call imposter syndrome, a psychological pattern in which individuals attribute their success to external factors like luck, timing, or the help of others rather than to their own skills, intelligence, or effort. The person experiencing imposter syndrome engages in a peculiar form of mental accounting where accomplishments are systematically discounted, while failures or mistakes are magnified and internalized as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. This phenomenon emerges partly from how our brains process information through confirmation bias, a cognitive tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm our pre-existing beliefs about ourselves. When someone harbors a deep-seated belief that they are not truly capable, their mind becomes a filter that dismisses positive feedback as politeness or deception, while treating criticism as validation of their suspected unworthiness. Additionally, the human brain relies on an availability heuristic, meaning we judge the frequency or likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. And for many people, memories of failure and embarrassment are far more vivid and accessible than memories of success. The persistence of imposter syndrome, despite overwhelming objective evidence of competence, reveals something profound about how disconnected our internal narratives can become from external reality, suggesting that no amount of external validation can fully convince someone who's. Imagine a person who has just learned the basics of a skill taking on a project far beyond their ability with absolute confidence, while an expert in the same field hesitates and second-guesses themselves despite their mastery. This paradoxical phenomenon plays out constantly in workplaces, classrooms, and social gatherings around the world, where those with the least knowledge often display the most certainty about their understanding. Someone might confidently diagnose a medical condition after reading a single article online, or insist they could manage a corporation after watching a few business documentaries, their conviction utterly unshaken by the vast complexity they cannot yet perceive. Meanwhile, accomplished surgeons and seasoned executives wrestle with doubt and imposter syndrome, acutely aware of how much remains unknown within their domains of expertise. The mechanism driving this inversion of confidence stems from a fundamental cognitive blind spot. A lack of knowledge prevents people from recognizing what they do not know. When you possess only surface-level understanding of a field, you lack the conceptual framework necessary to evaluate the depth and breadth of that field, leaving you unable to accurately assess your own incompetence. Your brain creates an illusion of competence by filling gaps with assumptions and oversimplifications that feel intuitively correct. As people genuinely develop expertise, however, they encounter the sobering vastness of what remains to be learned, each answer generating 10 new questions, each mastered technique revealing unexplored subtleties. This awareness naturally dampens confidence even as actual ability climbs. The effect persists because we navigate daily life believing we understand far more than we truly do, and this comfortable illusion rarely faces direct challenge in conversations with similarly uninformed peers who validate our misplaced certainty. Imagine walking into a crowded coffee shop with a visible stain on your shirt, or stumbling slightly as you enter a classroom full of students. And in that moment, you feel absolutely certain that everyone in the room has noticed your mistake and is now judging you for it. This powerful sensation of being watched and evaluated, this conviction that you are the center of attention and scrutiny, is what psychologists call the spotlight effect, a cognitive bias so pervasive that it shapes how we move through the world and interact with others on a daily basis. The spotlight effect describes our tendency to overestimate how much other people notice us, how much they care about our appearance or behavior, and how much they are paying attention to our small moments of awkwardness or perceived failure. When we make a social misstep, we feel as though an invisible spotlight has turned on us, illuminating our flaw to everyone around us, when in reality most people are far too preoccupied with their own concerns, their own insecurities, and their own internal narratives to dedicate significant mental energy to observing or remembering your mistake. The mechanism underlying this bias stems from what researchers call egocentric bias, the natural human tendency to view the world from our own perspective as the primary reference point. Since you are always at the center of your own awareness, always acutely conscious of your own thoughts and feelings and perceived flaws, it becomes psychologically difficult to imagine that other people are not similarly focused on you. Your own discomfort feels so vivid and consuming that you assume it must be visible to everyone else, that your embarrassment must radiate outward like that literal spotlight. Furthermore, we tend to overweight the information that is most available to us in our memory, and since our own mistakes and awkward moments are typically the most emotionally salient and therefore the most memorable too. Imagine a person collapses on a crowded street, their body suddenly going limp as they fall to the pavement, gasping for breath, clearly in dire need of immediate assistance. Around them stands a circle of onlookers, dozens of people who have stopped and turned their attention toward the scene unfolding before their eyes. Yet despite the obvious emergency and the presence of so many potential helpers, minutes pass in silence as the person lies motionless, and nobody moves to intervene or call for help, each bystander standing frozen in a peculiar state of inaction while the crisis deepens. This phenomenon, known as the bystander effect, reveals something counterintuitive about human psychology that challenges our assumptions about morality and responsibility. When we witness an emergency or crisis unfold before us, our likelihood of helping does not increase with the number of people present, but rather it decreases substantially, a reversal of what logic might suggest. The mechanism underlying this strange behavior operates through several interconnected psychological processes that occur almost unconsciously in our minds. First, there exists what researchers call diffusion of responsibility, wherein each individual assumes that someone else in the crowd will step forward to help, creating an illusion that the responsibility is shared equally among all present and therefore belongs entirely to nobody in particular. Simultaneously, pluralistic ignorance takes effect, a state in which we look to the reactions of others to interpret the situation, and since everyone else appears calm and inactive, we conclude that perhaps the situation is not actually as serious as it seemed, or that our intervention is unnecessary because the problem will resolve itself. Picture yourself walking down a busy street when you notice a crowd of people stopped and staring upward at the sky, their faces turned collectively towards some invisible point above the buildings. Without seeing anything unusual yourself, you find your eyes drawn upward as well, your body unconsciously joining the group, and within moments you too are searching the clouds for whatever has captured their attention. This is herd mentality in its most visible form, a psychological phenomenon where individuals adopt the beliefs, behaviors, or emotional responses of a larger group, often without conscious deliberation or logical reasoning. The mechanism behind this behavior runs deep into our evolutionary past, rooted in the understanding that our ancestors survived through cooperation and group cohesion, where following the lead of others often meant the difference between finding food, avoiding predators, or accessing resources before competitors did. Our brains developed shortcuts that allowed us to assume that if many people believe something or are doing something, then it must be correct or safe, a mental efficiency that once served us well in survival situations. When we observe others exhibiting a particular behavior or expressing a shared belief, our mirror neurons activate, creating an automatic tendency to replicate what we see, and simultaneously, the social pressure to conform activates regions in our brain associated with anxiety and reward, making alignment with the group feel comfortable and deviation feel uncomfortable. What remains particularly fascinating is how this ancient survival mechanism persists so powerfully in modern contexts where it often serves no logical purpose and can even work against our individual interests, such as when crowds panic unnecessarily, when financial bubbles form through collective irrational investing, or when false rumors spread through populations despite readily available contradictory information. Imagine yourself sitting in a room with 8 other people, all strangers, and you are asked to participate in what seems like a simple visual test where you must identify which of 3 lines matches the length of a reference line. The answer is obvious, unmistakably clear, yet when you listen to the person before you give an answer that is objectively wrong, and then the next person agrees, and the next, something peculiar begins to happen inside your mind. A subtle pressure builds, a quiet voice whispers doubt, and despite knowing with absolute certainty that your eyes are correct, you find yourself wondering if perhaps you are the one who is mistaken. This is conformity pressure, and it is one of the most fascinating and troubling aspects of human social behavior that reveals just how deeply our need to belong can override our individual perception of reality itself. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in our evolutionary heritage as social creatures who depended on group membership for survival, safety, and access to resources. When we find ourselves in a group, our brain automatically activates a powerful social monitoring system that constantly evaluates whether our beliefs, behaviors, and expressions align with those around us. When we detect a discrepancy between our own perspective and the group consensus, our brain interprets this as a potential social threat, triggering the release of stress hormones and activating regions associated with social pain. To alleviate this discomfort, we experience an overwhelming urge to bring ourselves into alignment with the group, whether through genuine belief change or simple behavioral compliance. Over countless generations, this mechanism kept our ancestors alive by preventing ostracism and ensuring cohesive group function during times when being cast out from the tribe meant almost certain death.